What if the most powerful people in history were also the most hated? Behind the gold and titles lies a darker truth. Kings overthrown, queens booed in the streets, royal weddings met with riots. This isn't a history of triumph. It's a dossier of downfall. From whispered conspiracies to full-blown rebellions, these are the 27 most despised English royals, ranked not by gossip, but by the fury they inspired. Forget fairy tales. This is monarchy at its most dangerous. Before we dive in, if dark royal history is your thing, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. We drop stories that textbooks skip and bedtime fears remember. Also, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who else is up chasing ghosts in the monarchy. 1. King John. King. John did not walk onto the English throne so much as stumble onto it, dragging behind him a reputation that already smelled faintly of betrayal, broken oaths, and unpaid debts. By the time he became king in 1199, people did not so much hope he would rule well as wonder how badly he might fail. This is important because King John did not invent his own unpopularity. He inherited it. Then he refined it. Then he weaponized it. History would later nickname him Lackland, a label that sounds almost playful until you realize it describes a man who lost nearly everything he touched. Territories in France, the loyalty of his barons, the trust of the church. Eventually, even the basic assumption that a king deserved obedience. That last one turned out to be the most dangerous thing he ever lost. John ruled in an era when kings were expected to be heavy-handed. Violence, intimidation, and taxation were not unusual. The problem was not that John ruled harshly, it was that he ruled unpredictably. He punished without warning, forgave without reason, demanded money without explanation, and reversed decisions as if consistency itself offended him. To the medieval political class, this was not just annoying, it was terrifying. Power in John's England rested on a fragile bargain. The king demanded service and money. In return, he provided protection, justice, and stability. John treated that bargain like a suggestion. He levied enormous financial demands on his barons, often inventing new fees or reviving old ones simply because he could. In theory, these were legal. In practice, they felt like extortion conducted with royal paperwork. Barons were fined not for crimes, but for inconveniencing the king. Widows were charged to remarry. Heirs paid massive sums to inherit their own lands. Disputes were resolved not by law, but by who paid more. Justice became transactional, and everyone noticed. Chroniclers noticed. Nobles noticed. Even people far below the political elite felt the pressure ripple outward. John's obsession with money was not greed for luxury alone, though he enjoyed spending. It was desperation. He had lost vast territories in France that his predecessors had ruled for generations. Normandy, the jewel of the Angevin Empire, slipped through his fingers after military failures that looked less like bad luck and more like incompetence. Losing land meant losing revenue. Losing revenue meant squeezing England harder. England in turn began to hate him for it. Military failure followed him like a curse. John planned campaigns meticulously, then abandoned them suddenly. He promised support, then vanished when it mattered. Allies learned that trusting him was a gamble with terrible odds. Enemies learned that patience would eventually be rewarded. His reputation abroad collapsed first. His authority at home soon followed. But what truly poisoned his reign was not defeat. It was distrust. John did not just punish enemies, he punished friends. Barons who supported him one year might find themselves fined, humiliated, or dispossessed the next. Loyalty offered no protection. Silence offered no safety. The safest position in John's England was neutrality, and even that came at a price. The church, which medieval kings usually treated with caution, became another enemy. John quarreled with the papacy over the appointment of an archbishop. When the Pope responded with spiritual sanctions, John responded by seizing church property. For years, England lived under a kind of religious suspension, with rituals disrupted and authority blurred. To a deeply religious society, this felt like living under a curse brought on by royal stubbornness. By the second decade of his reign, opposition had stopped whispering. It began organizing. The barons did not rise against John because they were idealists dreaming of liberty. They rose because the system had stopped working. A king who could not be trusted to follow his own rules was not a king who could be negotiated with. And if negotiation was impossible, force became inevitable. When rebellion finally broke out, it was not chaotic. It was deliberate, calculated. The rebels framed their demands not as revolution, but as restoration. They claimed to be defending ancient customs, traditional rights, and lawful kingship itself. John, in this narrative, was not a bad ruler. He was an unlawful one. Cornered and desperate, John agreed to meet the rebels. What followed was not reconciliation. It was coercion. The document forced upon him was later called Magna Carta, and history would wrap it in reverent language about freedom and rights. At the time, it was something colder. A list of accusations. A catalogue of grievances. A written record of how thoroughly the king had alienated the political class that was supposed to support him. John did not sign it willingly. He sealed it under pressure, surrounded by armed men who no longer trusted his word, and almost immediately he tried to undo it. He appealed to the Pope, denounced the charter, and prepared for war. The message was clear. Even when restrained, John could not be relied upon. Civil war followed. England fractured. Castles changed hands. Foreign princes were invited to take the English throne, not because they were loved, but because John was despised. Think about that. The barons preferred a foreign claimant to their own crowned king. John's death in 1216 saved him from complete political annihilation. He did not die gloriously. He died exhausted, ill, and still at war with his own country. His son inherited a kingdom in chaos, but also an opportunity. By blaming John for everything that had gone wrong, the new regime could reset the narrative. Magna Carta was reissued. Rebellion cooled. Order slowly returned. John became the villain who made compromise possible. And that is the final irony. King John is remembered not because he was uniquely cruel or unusually stupid, but because he was uniquely bad at maintaining trust. Other kings demanded money. Other kings lost wars. Other kings bullied their nobles. John managed to do all three at once, while convincing everyone around him that tomorrow would be worse than today. His hatred was not loud at first. It grew methodically. Complaint by complaint, fine by fine, broken promise by broken promise, until rebellion felt less like treason and more like self-defense. England would produce many unpopular monarchs after him. Some would rule longer. Some would be more flamboyant. Some would meet far more dramatic ends. But John set a precedent that haunted the throne for centuries. The idea that a king could be legally, morally, and politically challenged if he governed badly enough. That idea did not die with him. It waited. It watched. And 2 centuries later, it would return. This time aimed at a king who believed authority came from divine right, personal will, and a deeply fragile sense of majesty. Because if King John taught England how to hate a king, the next monarch on this list would teach it how to remove one. 2. Richard II. Richard II was born into a kingdom already fraying at the edges. He ascended the throne in 1377 at just 10 years old, an age when most children are learning not to set fire to things, not learning how to manage a collapsing monarchy. But England had run out of grown-ups it trusted, so the child was crowned. And soon after, people began to watch his every move with the grim patience of those expecting disappointment. At first, Richard was too young to truly offend. That job fell to his advisors, nobles and bishops appointed to govern in his name. And like all good caretakers of royal power, they governed mostly in their own interests. The peasants' revolt of 1381, fueled by resentment over poll taxes and endemic instability, thrust Richard into sudden and dangerous visibility. He was only 14 when he faced the rebels, and to the shock of almost everyone, he didn't run. He rode out. He spoke to them. He even promised reform. It was, arguably, the most impressive political moment of his life. Unfortunately, it was also the beginning of the end. Because Richard never forgot the experience. Not the danger, not the humiliation, and certainly not the fact that the people demanding his attention had done so with weapons in hand. He learned a lesson, but it was the wrong one, that royal authority must never, ever look weak again. As he matured, Richard became a king obsessed with image, loyalty, and control. And not the steady kind of control, the paranoid, performative kind. He surrounded himself with favorites, men he believed were personally loyal to him, rather than capable administrators or respected nobles. And when the political elite looked at these men, they didn't see loyalty. They saw dangerous influence, reckless policy, and exclusion from power. The discontent brewed quietly at first. England's ruling class had seen minority kings before. They knew how to wait. But Richard did not return the courtesy. He viewed criticism as betrayal and disagreement as treason. His household became a political weapon. His court a stage set for royal absolutism. He declared himself chosen by God, no longer just a ruler but a sacred presence. Kingship to Richard was not a contract. It was a performance. And woe to anyone who missed their cue. By the late 1380s, his government had begun to implode under the weight of faction. In response, a coalition of nobles, later called the Lords Appellant, decided that Richard's inner circle had to go. Not metaphorically, literally. In a move of ruthless clarity, they accused several of the king's closest allies of treason. The merciless Parliament of 1388 followed. Several were executed. The rest fled or vanished. For a while, it looked like Richard might end up a ceremonial king in his own kingdom. But he waited, bided his time. And when the opportunity came, he struck back. The 1390s saw Richard at his most dangerous. Older now and far more deliberate, he began to rebuild his authority piece by piece. He made peace with France, a decision that pleased no one but calmed the budget. He restored some order. And he remembered every name of every man who had ever opposed him. One by one, he isolated his enemies. Then he made them disappear. Not all by force. Richard had developed a more elegant tool, law. He used Parliament to pass judgments. He framed political revenge as legal consequence. By 1397, his earlier enemies were either executed, exiled, or rendered irrelevant. And England's political class began to realize something horrifying. The king had learned how to be cruel within the rules. This is when things tipped from uneasy to unlivable. Richard began elevating loyalists to outrageous levels of power, rewarding favorites with lands, titles, and influence far beyond what was normal. He passed laws that made it treason to even plan to resist the king, creating a suffocating political atmosphere. Surveillance increased. Dissent was painted as sacrilege. And Richard, once the fragile boy king, now spoke like a divine monarch, untouched by the rules that bound other men. The final blow came in 1399, and like all good downfalls, it began with a miscalculation. Richard exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, ostensibly over a noble dispute. But when Bolingbroke's father died and Richard seized his inheritance, it was more than a personal insult. It was a declaration that even blood and birthright meant nothing if the king said so. That broke something. Bolingbroke returned with an army, not a massive one, but large enough. And England, already weary of Richard's rule, didn't rise to stop him. Barons defected. Castles surrendered. Even Richard's own allies hesitated. He was captured with almost no resistance. Deposition followed, but not in the chaotic, war-torn sense. It was scripted. Parliament was convened. Documents were read. A legal case was made for removing a king, not because he had lost battles, but because he had abused power. And just like that, England did something extraordinary. It removed a sitting king through process, not blood. It created precedent. A dangerous one. Richard's forced abdication in 1399 remains one of the sharpest breaks in English royal history. His crimes, as listed by his opponents, were not personal failures. They were political, misgovernment, tyranny, a refusal to heed counsel. He was not accused of madness or incompetence. He was accused of ruling as if the kingdom existed for his pleasure alone. And yet, the hatred toward Richard was not purely institutional. It was also deeply emotional. Chroniclers wrote of his vanity, his extravagance, his obsession with protocol and honorifics. He demanded to be called Your High Majesty before it became standard. He surrounded himself with symbolic power and expected reverence instead of results. To his enemies, this wasn't just annoying. It was offensive. Richard didn't just misunderstand his role. He redefined it in ways that made the political nation feel small, excluded, and powerless. In a medieval monarchy, where relationships and loyalty were everything, that made him not just disliked, but feared. His final years, spent in confinement and eventually ending in mysterious death, only sealed his fate. Rumors of starvation or murder swirled, but certainty was never required. By then, Richard had already become a cautionary tale. Ironically, the new king, Henry IV, had risen on the back of noble rebellion and the language of justice. But in doing so, he inherited the very anxieties that had undone Richard, fears of faction, legitimacy, and loyalty. And so the cycle continued. Richard's legacy is not a monument. It's a warning. That kings who mistake performance for power eventually find themselves performing their own downfall. And yet, for all his theatricality and legal tyranny, Richard did not die at the hands of a mob. He died in custody, quietly, as England moved on. The nation did not weep. It barely paused. Because England already knew worse was coming. The next king had all of Richard's flaws and none of his style. He was less theatrical, more obvious, less divine, more desperate. And unlike Richard, whose downfall was engineered by nobles, the next monarch's fate would be sealed by his own household, and a nation that finally decided enough was enough. If you're still here after that royal disaster, you might be one of us, the kind who prefers their history with a sharp edge and a late-night mood. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got plenty more crowned chaos ahead. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Is this your midnight mystery fix or a morning descent into madness? 3. Edward II. Edward II was never meant to be terrifying. He was meant to be forgettable. A transitional figure. The son of a warrior king, the father of a reformer, a placeholder between two stronger personalities. But Edward, like all placeholders left unattended too long, became a problem. Not through grand ambition, nor through cruelty, nor even through incompetence in the traditional sense. Edward II was despised because he misunderstood the nature of power in a kingdom held together by performance, patronage, and perception. And he paid for that misunderstanding in the most medieval way possible: deposition, humiliation, and historical erasure. Let's start with the obvious. Edward II did not inherit an easy job. His father, Edward I, had been the sort of king who made enemies in 3 different nations before breakfast. He conquered Wales, brutalized Scotland, and ruled England with a heavy, ironclad hand. He was feared, respected, and exhausting. When he died in 1307, the barons didn't weep. But they certainly didn't expect his heir to unravel things quite so quickly. Edward II came to the throne with soft hands, a suspicious entourage, and a habit of ignoring the people who knew how England actually worked. He didn't speak the language of war like his father. He didn't dominate his court with charisma or political mastery. What he did do was promote favorites, obvious ones, and elevate them to positions of enormous influence. That alone would have been dangerous. But Edward didn't stop there. He allowed those favorites to act with impunity, insulting old noble families and treating court politics like a private game. The first of these favorites was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon nobleman of decent background but utterly inadequate social standing for the power he was given. Edward adored him. In public, in court, in ceremonies, he gave Piers titles, wealth, and responsibilities that outraged the existing nobility. But it wasn't just about jealousy. It was about precedent. Medieval barons accepted royal favoritism, but only if it played by the rules. Gaveston didn't. He mocked powerful earls. He flaunted his status. He treated the old nobility like background noise in his personal drama with the king. The reaction was slow but inevitable. The nobility confronted Edward. They warned him. They passed ordinances to limit royal authority and exile Gaveston, and when that failed, they took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured, tried by a faction of lords, and executed without the king's consent. This was not subtle rebellion. It was elite political violence, and it sent a message. The king's personal affections did not override the political order. But Edward did not read it that way. He read it as a personal betrayal, and he responded not with strategy, but with sulking and stubbornness. Unfortunately, stubbornness without leverage isn't strength. And by 1314, Edward had managed to bring England to the brink of disaster. His invasion of Scotland, meant to reclaim glory and put down the independence movement led by Robert the Bruce, ended in the catastrophic defeat at Bannockburn. The English army, despite outnumbering their opponents, collapsed under poor leadership and worse morale. Edward fled the battlefield. His crown and his credibility slipped away. After Bannockburn, everything unraveled. Into this vacuum stepped the Despencer family, new favorites, more ambitious than Gaveston, and significantly more dangerous. The Despensers, particularly Hugh Despencer the Younger, learned nothing from their predecessor's fate. Or rather, they learned the wrong lesson, that so long as the king favored them, they could do anything. Land seizures, intimidation, legal manipulation. They became the face of a regime that no longer even pretended to share power. England noticed. Wales noticed. Even Edward's queen, Isabella of France, noticed, and began plotting. By 1321, opposition to the Despensers had turned into outright rebellion. The barons, now joined by former enemies of each other, declared war on the king's household. Civil conflict broke out across the kingdom. Edward, with the Despensers at his side, fought back with a brutal counteroffensive. Rebels were executed. Lands were confiscated. Power was centralized. For a brief, bloody moment, it looked as if Edward had won. But it wasn't stability. It was exhaustion. And then the queen disappeared. Isabella had gone to France on a diplomatic mission in 1325, ostensibly to negotiate with her brother, the French king. She refused to return. Instead, she began gathering allies. Chief among them was Roger Mortimer, a former rebel baron who had escaped prison and fled to France. Together, they launched an invasion of England in 1326. It wasn't a large invasion. It didn't need to be. Edward had burned so many bridges that when Isabella's forces landed, the country all but rolled out the red carpet. Nobles defected. Castles surrendered. Even Edward's own men hesitated to defend him. The Despensers were captured, tried, and executed. And Edward? He ran. He hid. Then he was captured by his own subjects and forced to abdicate. What makes Edward's fall extraordinary isn't the speed of it, it's the legality. Parliament was summoned. A formal deposition process was crafted. Edward was declared unfit to rule, and for the first time in English history, a reigning monarch was officially removed by a combination of political process and public consensus. It was, for medieval England, a revolutionary act. Edward II's unpopularity wasn't the product of one grand crime. It was the accumulation of failures, favoritism that alienated his peers, governance that ignored his responsibilities, and military incompetence that humiliated the realm. But what sealed his fate was his inability to read the room. He mistook loyalty for affection, governance for privilege, and kingship for entitlement. He thought being king meant he could do what he wanted. What England taught him, what it taught every monarch after him, was that being king meant doing what you must. After his deposition, Edward was placed in custody. Officially, he had abdicated in favor of his son, the future Edward III. Unofficially, he had been discarded. Rumors swirled about his fate, fed by decades of conspiracy and chronicler embellishment. But the political reality was clear. Edward had been judged, not just as a failure, but as a threat to the stability of the realm. And in his place rose a child king, another figurehead, another placeholder. But this time, with a different set of handlers. Because England had learned, again, that when the throne is filled by someone who doesn't understand how fragile power really is, the country doesn't wait for tragedy. It manufactures it. But Edward's story is not the end of deposition, nor the end of a regime cracking under the weight of its own illusions. Because the next man on the list believed he was chosen by God himself, and lost his crown not through rebellion, but through revolution. A king so distrusted by his subjects that they wrote him out of the kingdom by invitation. He wasn't removed. He was replaced. 4. James II and 7. James II was the kind of monarch who looked around a room filled with smoldering resentment, institutional distrust, and centuries of religious paranoia, and decided the best course of action was to light another match. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't particularly cruel. What he was stubborn, consistent, and terrifyingly sincere in his belief that everyone else was wrong. He inherited a throne soaked in tension. By the time he became king in 1685, England had been through a civil war, a regicide, a military dictatorship, and a royal restoration. It had torn itself in half over the relationship between crown and parliament, between Protestantism and Catholicism, between personal loyalty and public responsibility. The monarchy, once assumed to be unquestionable, now lived on parole. And then came James, a Catholic king in a Protestant nation, a man who believed not only in divine right but in divine authority. He didn't just think the king had power, he thought the king was power. To understand why that terrified people, you have to understand the political climate he stepped into. England had spent the latter half of the 17th century convincing itself that it had survived the worst. The monarchy had been restored in 1660 with Charles II, who, despite his own Catholic leanings and a taste for autocratic flirtation, knew how to read the mood. He knew when to retreat, when to compromise, when to laugh off criticism with a joke about his many mistresses. James did not joke. He was the first openly Catholic monarch since Mary I, and unlike Mary, who had ruled in a more explicitly religious age, James took power in an England that had built Protestantism into its national identity. Catholicism was not just a different religion, it was a political threat, a symbol of tyranny, a trigger for memory. The Gunpowder Plot, the Spanish Armada, the Marian burnings. Catholicism, in the English political imagination, was not a faith. It was a conspiracy. So when James began promoting Catholic officers in the army, people noticed. When he issued declarations suspending laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters, Parliament bristled. And when he began building a standing army outside the control of traditional institutions, everyone from bishops to butchers began to feel an old, familiar chill. But the breaking point was not policy. It was the perception that James was systematically unmaking the religious and political consensus that had held the country together since the Restoration. He wasn't just governing as a Catholic. He was trying to reprogram the nation. The flashpoint came in 1688 with the trial of the 7 bishops. These were not fringe radicals or political agitators. They were senior members of the Church of England, men who, in theory, represented the very foundation of the king's support base. When James tried to force them to publicly endorse his Declaration of Indulgence, a royal edict, promoting religious tolerance but seen by many as a Trojan horse for Catholic expansion, they refused, politely, formally. James had them arrested and tried for seditious libel. It was a stunning misstep. Public opinion exploded. The bishops became folk heroes overnight. Crowds cheered their release. The army wavered in its loyalty, and the elites, those who had spent years trying to manage or mitigate James's policies, finally decided enough was enough. But here's the twist. They didn't rebel. They invited someone else to take his place. This is what makes James II's fall unique. He wasn't overthrown by an angry mob or defeated on a battlefield. He was replaced through correspondence, a letter, an invitation. A polite, deeply treasonous request to William of Orange, the Dutch Protestant husband of James's daughter Mary, to come to England with an army and restore the nation's liberties. William obliged. He landed in November 1688 with a modest force, but what he brought with him wasn't just troops. It was legitimacy. The invitation, signed by several leading English nobles, gave him political cover. As he advanced through the country, James's support evaporated. His army refused to fight. His own daughter and son-in-law stood ready to take his crown. Faced with mass desertions, James panicked. He tried to flee. He was caught. He tried again. This time he succeeded. He escaped to France, where he would live out his remaining years as a guest of the French king, comforted perhaps by Catholic Mass and continental politeness, but stripped forever of English authority. The revolution that followed was dubbed glorious, not because it was bloodless, it wasn't entirely, but because it was clean. A monarch was removed and replaced without collapsing the state. Parliament, having flirted with rebellion for decades, now declared itself the final arbiter of legitimacy. The Bill of Rights, 1689, codified the terms: no suspending of laws without consent, no standing armies in peacetime without Parliament, no Catholic monarchs. Ever again. James II became a symbol, not just of tyranny, but of misreading the room. He wasn't hated for crimes. He wasn't a monster. He was something worse. A man so utterly convinced of his own rightness that he ignored every sign of disaster until it was too late. He didn't just fall. He was edited out. His son, the so-called Old Pretender, would attempt to claim the throne, sparking decades of Jacobite uprisings. But James himself remained a ghost, the monarch who wasn't overthrown, but overwritten. It's tempting to treat his story as a warning about religious extremism or the dangers of absolute monarchy. And it is those things. But more than anything, it's about the peril of isolation. James built a court that spoke only to itself. He governed with the logic of a man surrounded by mirrors. And when the real world came crashing in, he didn't know how to respond except to run. His reign was a case study in how quickly a king can lose his kingdom when he forgets that loyalty has limits, and that fear is a poor substitute for trust. But if James was undone by religious suspicion, the next king would discover a different kind of limit. A line drawn not by bishops or nobles, but by ordinary men and women armed with muskets and pamphlets. Because where James was invited to leave, his successor would be forced to stay. Inside a palace, under siege, while his own people tore the kingdom apart. And when the dust settled, they wouldn't exile him. They'd do something much harder. They'd put their king on trial. 5. Charles I. Charles I was not a man born for improvisation. He lived in a world of grand paintings, solemn rituals, and a belief that authority descended from heaven, not from the messy mechanics of Parliament. He ruled with the bearing of a man who thought the rules had already been written in his favor, and then watched, with quiet disbelief, as those rules were publicly torn apart by his own people. His fall didn't happen overnight. It was slow, deliberate, and so drenched in legal and religious drama that it could have been scripted by fate, or at least by a particularly sarcastic historian. But to understand why Charles I was so widely despised, enough to be deposed, imprisoned, and put on trial by the people he was meant to rule, you have to understand the quiet war he was waging long before the civil one broke out. He wasn't a tyrant in the theatrical sense. He was soft-spoken, polished, and polite. But he believed, with absolute conviction, that monarchy was sacred, that dissent was sacrilege, and that kings answered only to God. That belief by itself wasn't new. But Charles brought it into a political environment that had grown more skeptical, more assertive, and much more organized. The real problem wasn't Charles's personality. It was his refusal to play politics in a country that had become dangerously good at it. He inherited the throne in 1625, following the death of his father, James I, a monarch with his own flair for divine right, but at least a working relationship with Parliament. Charles, by contrast, regarded Parliament not as a partner, but as an obstacle. When they refused to fund his foreign wars, he dissolved them. When they returned with new demands, he dismissed them again. This wasn't just bad manners, it was a pattern. He ruled without Parliament entirely from 1629 to 1640, in a period known, almost sarcastically, as the personal rule. The term implies peace. In reality, it was a period of mounting resentment, because Charles didn't stop governing, he simply did it alone. To raise revenue, he revived long-dormant taxes like ship money, a levy originally designed for coastal defense during wartime. Charles demanded it in peacetime and extended it to inland counties. This move may sound bureaucratic, but it ignited political fury. People weren't just angry about money. They were angry about the principle, a king inventing taxes without consent. This wasn't just fiscal overreach, it was constitutional heresy. At the same time, Charles, along with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, began enforcing a more elaborate, ritualized form of Anglican worship. To his critics, this looked suspiciously like Catholicism, still deeply feared and distrusted by many in England. It wasn't just a matter of incense and kneeling. It was seen as part of a broader strategy to roll back the Reformation and suppress religious dissent. This made enemies, not just a few, a nation's worth. Puritans were appalled. Calvinists were alarmed. Even moderate Protestants began to wonder whether their king's priorities were more aesthetic than theological. To Charles, it was order. To his critics, it was spiritual betrayal. When Charles tried to impose a new Book of Common Prayer on Scotland in 1637, the response was immediate and furious. Scots rose up in protest, eventually forming the National Covenant, a direct rejection of royal religious authority. Charles's attempt to force compliance sparked a series of conflicts known as the Bishops' Wars, which he lost. Loss meant debt. Debt meant Parliament. And so, after 11 years of ruling alone, Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640 to ask for money. They did not forget the previous decade. The long Parliament that followed didn't just challenge the king, it dismantled his machinery. They executed his closest advisor, the Earl of Strafford. They passed legislation that limited his ability to dissolve Parliament again. They demanded control over ministers, over the army, over nearly every aspect of governance. Charles pretended to negotiate. Then, in January 1642, he made the worst decision of his life. He marched into the House of Commons with soldiers, intending to arrest 5 leading members of Parliament for treason. It was an act so brazen, so shocking, that even his sympathizers began to back away. The 5 men had already fled, and Charles left humiliated. Civil war followed. It was not just a clash of armies. It was a collapse of the political compact. Royalists, supporters of the king, fought parliamentarians, who saw themselves not as rebels, but as defenders of the English Constitution. At first, the war was evenly matched, but as the conflict dragged on, Parliament became more organized. Under leaders like Oliver Cromwell, it professionalized its army. It gained the upper hand militarily and politically. Charles, meanwhile, remained fatally consistent. He negotiated with all sides, promised different things to different factions, and attempted to play his enemies off each other. But in a country already weary of betrayal, this wasn't strategy, it was treachery. Captured in 1647, he was still treated with caution. Many in Parliament hoped to restore him with conditions. But Charles, never one to accept half measures, secretly encouraged a second civil war in 1648. That was the breaking point. The radical faction of the army, no longer willing to trust him, purged Parliament of moderates in what became known as Pride's Purge. What remained, the Rump Parliament, put the king on trial. It was unprecedented. Kings had been deposed before, imprisoned, exiled, even killed, but never tried in a public court by their own subjects under the authority of a legislative body. The trial was as much performance as prosecution. It asserted that Charles had violated not just law, but trust, that he had betrayed his people by treating the kingdom as his property. Charles refused to recognize the court. He spoke with dignity, defiance, and all the misplaced confidence that had defined his reign. But the verdict was already decided. He was found guilty of treason against the realm, not for being a tyrant, but for placing his authority above that of the nation. And so, England executed its king. What followed was not triumph, but unease. The monarchy was abolished, a republic declared, but the country had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. For many, Charles became a martyr. For others, a warning. But whether lionized or loathed, he was despised in his time by those who mattered most, the people who no longer believed he spoke for them. His fall was not personal. It was political. It was institutional. It was the result of a society that had finally learned how to say no and mean it. And yet, the story doesn't end with revolution, because power, like history, always finds a way to circle back. And the next man on our list knew how to exploit that cycle. He would take the throne not by right or conquest, but by myth, and then lose it just as quickly to rumor, propaganda, and whispers in the dark. A hunchbacked king, crowned in controversy, whose reign would unravel beneath the weight of 2 missing boys and a kingdom that could no longer tell the difference between treason and survival. 6. Richard III. Richard III has the unfortunate distinction of being one of the few English monarchs whose reign is almost entirely overshadowed by the mystery of how it ended, and the legends that followed. He ruled for just over 2 years, a blink in the timeline of monarchy, but in that brief period, he managed to become one of the most reviled and contested figures in English royal history. Not because of what he undeniably did, but because of what people believed he did. Richard wasn't born a villain. He was born a Yorkist prince in a country ripping itself apart through the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long family feud between the rival houses of Lancaster and York that made Game of Thrones look like a garden party. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already survived more political purges, military campaigns, and sudden changes of regime than most courtiers experienced in a lifetime. He was the younger brother of King Edward IV, a charismatic warrior king who seized the throne, lost it, seized it again, and then died unexpectedly in 1483, leaving a precarious legacy in the hands of his 12-year-old son. Enter Richard. When Edward IV died, his heir, Edward V, was too young to rule. A regency was needed. As the late king's loyal brother, Richard was named Lord Protector. He took custody of young Edward and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, placing them in the Tower of London for their safety, a phrase that would age about as well as milk left in the sun. Then things escalated with suspicious speed. Within months, Richard declared that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid on the grounds of a pre-contract, rendering Edward V and his siblings illegitimate. Parliament passed a bill, Titulus Regius, confirming this claim. And just like that, the rightful heir was erased from the line of succession, and Richard was crowned king. Now, English history is no stranger to creative legal maneuvers. But this one felt less like legal tidying and more like a hostile corporate takeover. Many of the political elite looked on in stunned silence. Some saw efficiency, others saw ambition. A few saw treason, but not enough to stop it. Not yet. And then the princes disappeared. Edward V and his younger brother were never seen again after mid-1483. There were no public funerals, no official statements, no confirmed sightings. Just two boys who vanished into one of the most famous silences in history. Richard claimed innocence. He didn't speak of them. And to be fair, there's no definitive proof he ordered their deaths. But in politics, absence is not the same as absolution. The public, the nobility, and foreign powers began whispering, then shouting. The man who had promised to safeguard his nephews now ruled in their place, and the boys were gone. It didn't require much imagination to connect the dots. Whether he was guilty or not, Richard's reputation collapsed. Fast. His enemies seized on the uncertainty. The Lancastrian cause, long thought dead, found a new figurehead in Henry Tudor, a minor claimant living in exile in Brittany. Henry's claim was weak. His resources were limited. But his timing was perfect. Because Richard wasn't just ruling with controversy. He was ruling without consensus. His court was paranoid. His allies uneasy. Even some of his original supporters began slipping away, uncomfortable with how power had changed hands. And it didn't help that Richard, though a capable administrator and battlefield commander, lacked the charm or myth-making of his brother Edward IV. He was stiff, severe, and fatally honest in an era that rewarded theater. To rebuild support, Richard tried policy. He issued reforms to protect debtors, to regulate bail, and to increase access to justice for the poor. Ironically, had he ruled longer, he might have earned the reputation of a just king. But no one was listening, because rumors are louder than reforms, and by late 1483, the air around Richard's reign had grown toxic. Then came the propaganda. Opponents began flooding England with stories of Richard's tyranny. He was cast not merely as a usurper, but as a child killer, a monster, a deformed manipulator who had clawed his way to power over the bodies of innocents. Many of these tales were exaggerated, if not entirely invented. But it didn't matter. They worked. Henry Tudor landed in England in 1485 with a modest force. Richard met him at the Battle of Bosworth. The armies were not mismatched. Richard's should have won. But in a fatal act of personal bravery or desperation, depending on your view, he charged into the thick of battle, aiming to strike down Henry himself. He was unhorsed and killed, and with that, the Plantagenet dynasty ended. The Tudor one began, and history was promptly rewritten. Shakespeare, writing under Tudor rule a century later, made Richard III into a theatrical villain for the ages, hunched, bitter, bloodthirsty, and cunning. It's easy to scoff at this portrayal now, but in truth, the narrative had already begun during Richard's lifetime. The Tudors didn't invent Richard's unpopularity. They simply institutionalized it, and that's what makes his story so morally queasy. Unlike John or Charles I, Richard didn't fall because he defied the realm or broke the law. He fell because he lost the story, because he was surrounded by unanswered questions, unresolved disappearances, and an image crisis he couldn't fix. Was he guilty? We don't know. But that didn't stop people from acting like they did. He died fighting, one of the few English kings to die in open battle. But even in death, he was buried without ceremony, without crown, without legacy. Lost for centuries under a parking lot in Leicester. Rediscovered only in the 21st century, his bones revealing nothing about his guilt, but everything about his mythology. Richard III was not hated solely because of what he did. He was hated because of what people thought he did, and because in the end, he lacked the charisma or cunning to rewrite the script. And yet the story didn't end with Richard's body in an unmarked grave, because the next monarch, though triumphant, would face her own storm of resentment, not over succession or murder, but over faith. She was crowned with celebration, but very quickly she would come to be feared, not for disappearing children, but for burning heretics. 7. Mary I. Mary. I entered history carrying too many burdens and far too few illusions. The first queen regnant in English history, she was expected to rule like a man, fix a nation that distrusted her very identity, and heal a kingdom whose soul had been scorched by decades of religious whiplash. No pressure. She inherited the throne in 1553 after a chaotic succession crisis that felt less like a transition of power and more like a national panic attack. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken with the Catholic Church. Her half-brother, Edward VI, had taken the Protestant reforms further. And now, Mary, staunchly Catholic, proudly Marian in more than name, was about to reverse the entire direction of the English Reformation, with the soft voice of a woman who did not intend to ask permission. At first, the public rejoiced. The alternative, Lady Jane Grey, a teenager installed by political schemers, felt artificial and unwanted. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the child of a queen who had once represented everything noble, foreign, and devout. She marched into London with dignity, backed by crowds who saw her as the legitimate heir, and maybe even as a balm to the chaos of recent decades. But legitimacy is not the same as love, and relief is not the same as trust. It did not take long for that relief to curdle into fear. Because Mary did not see her reign as a political opportunity. She saw it as a divine correction. She was going to save England's soul, whether it wanted saving or not. The moment she took the throne, Mary began reversing her father's and brother's reforms. The Protestant bishops were imprisoned. Papal supremacy was restored. Heresy laws were reintroduced. England, so recently turned from Rome, was now rejoined with it, almost by force of will. Mary was determined, deliberate, and doctrinally inflexible. And then she announced her marriage plans. This was the second spark. The match with Philip II of Spain, her cousin and one of the most powerful Catholic monarchs in Europe, was not simply unpopular. It was politically radioactive. The English political class, already nervous about the return to Catholicism, now feared becoming a client state of the Spanish Empire. The press exploded. Rumors spread. Nobles grumbled. Commoners rioted. Then came Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. It was not a full-scale civil war, but it was dangerous. A coalition of gentry, former reformers, and anti-Spanish agitators raised arms and marched toward London. Their goal wasn't always clear. Stop the marriage, remove Mary, replace her with Elizabeth. But the message was unmistakable. A significant portion of the country was not merely skeptical of Mary's vision. It was ready to fight it. Mary crushed the rebellion, and in doing so, something in her shifted, or perhaps hardened. She imprisoned Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister and heir presumptive, in the Tower. Though she spared her life, she never trusted her again. From that point on, Mary's rule became less about reconciliation and more about purification, and that is where her true infamy was born. Between 1555 and 1558, under Mary's reintroduction of heresy laws, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. Bishops, ministers, commoners, men and women alike. The executions were not hidden. They were public. They were symbolic. They were meant to be warnings, lessons, purgations. But the lesson most people took away wasn't spiritual clarity. It was fear. This campaign, intended to restore spiritual unity, instead burned Mary's legacy into the national conscience with a cruelty that outlasted her body. She didn't personally light the flames, but she sanctioned the policy, defended it, and believed deeply in its necessity. To Mary, these were not executions. They were salvations. She saw herself not as a tyrant, but as a surgeon, cutting away infection to save the body of England. To the Protestants watching their friends, families, and leaders burn, it was horror in real time. And after her death, the survivors wrote it all down. The most famous of these chroniclers was John Foxe, whose Book of Martyrs became one of the most influential works of Protestant history. In its pages, Mary became Bloody Mary, a queen defined entirely by death, flames, and foreignness. It was not fair. It was not balanced. But it was effective. Mary's personal tragedies only sharpened the bitterness of her public image. Her much-anticipated marriage to Philip produced no heir. Her 2 phantom pregnancies, likely symptoms of severe health issues, ended in humiliation. Philip, ever practical, left her behind to pursue his ambitions abroad. She spent her final years increasingly isolated, increasingly devout, and increasingly convinced that her suffering was a test of righteousness. When she died in 1558, the public did not mourn as they had for her father or even her brother. They exhaled. Her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne and immediately reversed her policies. The Protestants returned. The propaganda flooded in. And Mary's brief, turbulent reign became the cautionary tale that generations would use to explain why England should never again return to Rome. But here's the part history doesn't always like to sit with. Mary was not hated because she was a woman, or because she was Catholic, or even because of the fires, at least not entirely. She was hated because she ruled with the certainty of someone who had suffered too long and trusted too little. Her faith had been shaped by abandonment, exile, and betrayal. Her politics were forged in crisis. She had learned the hard way that mercy could be mistaken for weakness. And so, she refused to bend. That refusal made her look monstrous to those who wanted moderation. It made her look foreign to those who wanted a Protestant future. And it made her look tyrannical to a public already trained to fear anything that didn't look like Elizabeth. And yet, under the ashes of her reputation is a more unsettling truth. Mary didn't fail because she was cruel. She failed because she tried to make England into something it no longer was, and refused to believe it wouldn't follow her back. But the next monarch didn't try to pull the country backward. He charged forward, dismantling monasteries, marrying 6 times, and leaving behind a trail of bodies, broken alliances, and rebellions so vast they almost swallowed the kingdom. His name would be remembered by every schoolchild, not because he was loved, but because everyone feared what would happen when he wasn't. 8. Henry VIII. Henry VIII didn't start out hated. He started out dazzling. Young, athletic, charismatic, fluent in multiple languages, trained in theology, music, and warcraft, a Renaissance prince in a kingdom starved for spectacle. The people loved him at first. His court was lively, his image carefully crafted, and his rule seemed full of promise. But power is not a mirror. It reflects only what it wants to see. And Henry, more than any monarch before him, became addicted to his own reflection. He didn't set out to become one of the most feared and resented rulers in English history. He simply believed he was always right. And when he wasn't, he changed the rules until he was. Henry's descent into infamy began with a problem that was both deeply personal and dangerously political: a lack of a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess his father had arranged for him, had produced only one surviving child, Mary. No sons, no clear succession, no peace of mind. In a medieval monarchy, that wasn't just a family concern. It was a national crisis waiting to happen. And so, in the late 1520s, Henry began pursuing an annulment. Not because he had fallen out of love, though he had, and not just because Anne Boleyn had entered the picture, though she certainly had, but because Henry believed God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. He cited Leviticus. He cited his conscience. But mostly, he wanted a male heir, and he was convinced that Catherine could no longer provide one. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. Normally, that would have ended the conversation. But Henry was not in the mood to be told no. What followed was not just a divorce. It was a rupture. Henry rejected papal authority and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a rebranding. It was a revolution in religious and political power. Centuries of ecclesiastical structure were swept aside because one man wanted a son. He dissolved the monasteries. He seized church lands. He redistributed wealth and property, not to the poor, but to the gentry and the crown. This was not reform. It was plunder disguised as piety. And while some welcomed the shake-up, especially those who profited from it, many more watched in horror as sacred spaces were gutted and centuries-old traditions extinguished overnight. The most visible resistance came in 1536, with the Pilgrimage of Grace. Centered in the north, the rebellion drew thousands of participants, commoners, gentry, even some clergy, who marched under banners of the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding a halt to the religious upheaval, the restoration of the monasteries, and the removal of Henry's new advisors. It was not a spontaneous riot. It was organized, articulate, and deeply rooted in community grievance. The rebellion's name was no accident. It cast itself not as treason, but as a pilgrimage, a moral correction. The participants were not fighting against their king, they claimed. They were fighting for him, against the evil counselors misleading him. Henry crushed it anyway. He promised pardon. He lied. He executed the leaders. Then he made sure everyone knew exactly what betrayal would cost. This event, more than almost any other, shifted the national mood. Henry had not just broken with Rome. He had broken with the people who once cheered his coronation. The northern counties never fully trusted him again. Meanwhile, his personal life became a national preoccupation and a national embarrassment. He married 6 times. He annulled or executed half of them. Wives became political currency. The court became a place of paranoia, factions, and abrupt reversals. No one stayed in favor for long. Counselors who had once shaped policy were suddenly arrested, executed, or simply vanished. Even his closest allies were disposable. Thomas More, once his friend and Lord Chancellor, was executed for refusing to accept Henry as the head of the church. Thomas Cromwell, his architect of reform, was beheaded after arranging a marriage the king found displeasing. Henry's mood became law, and the law became unpredictable. To rule under Henry was to live on a knife's edge, and yet many still obeyed. Not because they loved him, because they feared him. The machinery of the Tudor state under Henry was one of surveillance, coercion, and performance. Loyalty had to be visible. Dissent had to be non-existent. People were fined, jailed, or executed for what they wrote, what they said, or what they were rumored to have thought. And though Henry never saw another rebellion on the scale of the Pilgrimage of Grace, the unrest never fully vanished. It lingered, in pamphlets, in sermons whispered from pulpits, in silence during royal processions. The resentment wasn't always loud, but it was constant. Even the Reformation itself, which Henry unleashed, was something he never fully understood. He wasn't a Protestant, wasn't a reformer. He remained Catholic in theology. He broke with the Pope, not with the faith. But the break had consequences. England's religious identity became a battleground that would rage for generations. And Henry lit the fuse. By the time he died in 1547, he was obese, physically decaying, and isolated. The young, hopeful prince of 1509 was gone. In his place was a man who had ruled by fear, consumed loyalty, and left a trail of broken institutions, broken alliances, and broken expectations. And yet, his legacy was monumental. He reshaped England, not with vision, but with volatility. Not through popularity, but through force. He wasn't hated by everyone. Some admired his authority, his power, even his contradictions. But he was deeply resented by those who bore the weight of his decisions, from the northern rebels to the silent monks dragged from their abbeys. He left behind a country exhausted, uncertain, and divided, yet more centralized and powerful than it had ever been. Henry believed in control, and he got it. But the cost was a nation that learned, again, how close the crown could sit to tyranny. And the next man on our list would learn that lesson the hard way. Because while Henry ruled with spectacle and domination, his heir would rule with indecision and distance, and discover that sometimes losing the love of the people doesn't take fire and sword. Sometimes all it takes is a bad match, a quiet scandal, and the collapse of public confidence. 9. Edward VIII. Edward VIII reigned for just 326 days. He signed no major laws, fought no wars, and never wore the crown in a coronation. And yet, his time on the throne triggered one of the most profound constitutional crises in British history. He is remembered less for what he did as king than for why he stopped being one. Less for ruling than for walking away. From duty, from tradition, and from the very idea of monarchy as a serious institution. But what gets overlooked is this. Edward wasn't simply a romantic who gave up the throne for love. He was a monarch whose actions, style, and worldview deeply unnerved the establishment. Long before his abdication speech ever echoed over the airwaves, he was not loved. He was not trusted. And for many in the government, his departure was not a tragedy. It was a relief. Edward was born in 1894, the first child of the future George V. As Prince of Wales, he quickly became a national symbol, young, fashionable, energetic, and photogenic, in a way his stiff, traditional family wasn't. During the First World War, he visited troops at the front, earning the admiration of soldiers and press alike. But those who knew him more intimately saw signs of trouble, restlessness, recklessness, a distaste for rules, and an eye for personal gratification. He disliked ceremony. He mocked royal tradition. He chafed at his handlers. And while his early popularity soared, it came with a nagging sense that Edward was more interested in being admired than being useful. By the 1920s and 30s, his private life became increasingly public and increasingly controversial. He surrounded himself with wealthy socialites, many of whom were American divorcees, at a time when such relationships were considered scandalous. He partied, he traveled, he spoke candidly, often politically, in a monarchy that had been trained to avoid controversy. The British monarchy, especially after the trauma of World War I, was trying to rebrand itself as stable, sober, and above the political fray. Edward, by contrast, seemed more interested in being modern, glamorous, and emotionally expressive. It made him magnetic to the public, and deeply alarming to the establishment. But the real crisis began in the 1930s, with the emergence of Wallis Simpson. She was an American socialite, twice divorced, witty, worldly, and unapologetically bold. Edward fell for her completely. By 1936, it was clear to everyone in his inner circle that he intended to marry her. There was one problem. Under Church of England doctrine, of which the monarch was supreme governor, a marriage to a divorced woman with living ex-husbands was forbidden. For a time, the crisis remained a whisper. British newspapers, under a kind of self-imposed censorship, largely ignored the affair. But foreign outlets, particularly in the U.S., were less discreet. And as Edward ascended the throne in January 1936, his determination to marry Wallis became impossible to ignore. The Minister, Stanley Baldwin, confronted him. The government would not accept Wallis as queen. Parliament would not support the marriage. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, were unanimously opposed. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury weighed in against it. Edward had options. He could have ended the relationship. He could have married her and faced a constitutional crisis. Or he could abdicate. He chose the third. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII addressed the nation in a radio broadcast that, while now famous, masked the complexity of the situation. He said he could not continue without the help and support of the woman I love. It sounded noble, romantic, tragic even, but for many in power, this was not about love, it was about fitness to rule. Behind closed doors, there had already been concerns. Edward had expressed admiration for certain authoritarian leaders on the continent. His political comments made civil servants uneasy. His unwillingness to follow the advice of ministers, to grasp the delicate balance between crown and parliament, left many convinced he lacked the temperament for constitutional monarchy. His abdication was not just the result of one scandalous relationship, it was the endpoint of a larger pattern. A monarch who seemed to treat the crown as an accessory, not an obligation. When he left, few in the political elite wept. His younger brother, the reluctant George VI, took the throne. The monarchy stabilized. The Second World War came and went, and Edward faded into a kind of royal exile, given the title Duke of Windsor, and shuffled off to continental Europe with Wallace in tow. He lived for decades after, stylish, well-dressed, occasionally photographed, often spoken of as a cautionary tale. He wrote memoirs. He granted interviews. But he never returned to real influence. The monarchy moved on without him. What makes Edward VIII so significant in this list isn't just that he was unpopular with ministers. It's that his personal style, his tone, his preferences, his emotional impulsiveness so thoroughly clashed with the job of being king that his own government quietly maneuvered him out of it. His unpopularity was institutional. Behind the politeness of official statements was a clear message: he could not be trusted to rule. And so, he didn't. He remains the only English monarch to voluntarily resign the throne. But that resignation wasn't a solitary act of love. It was a final move in a quiet game of rejection, played by ministers, bishops, and empire officials who decided that if Edward wouldn't adapt to the crown would simply move on without him. And yet, the monarchy would not stay controversy-free for long, because the next in line wasn't just a king. He was a walking contradiction, a man of immense power with almost no moral authority, a prince who would become a symbol of everything his people had learned to mock. And when he ruled, they didn't rebel. They laughed, loudly and often. 10. George IV, as Prince Regent and King. If Edward VIII was a scandal dressed in silk gloves, George IV was a scandal draped in velvet, jewels, debt, and roast pheasant. He didn't quietly stumble into unpopularity. He paraded into it, deliberately, flamboyantly, and with a wine glass in one hand and a satirical cartoon of himself in the other. Long before he ever became king, George was despised, first as a prince who cost the public a fortune, then as a regent who seemed allergic to restraint, and finally, as a king who made even his own coronation into a punchline. Born in 1762, the eldest son of George III, young George grew up in a household that was both devout and demanding. His father, famously serious and infamously strict, believed in duty, thrift, and Protestant morality. George believed in none of those things. By his teens, he had developed a taste for fast horses, expensive tailors, and risky relationships. He began accumulating debt at a rate that would have impressed a small country. By his 20s, he had secretly and illegally married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, just to spite the royal succession laws. Parliament eventually bailed him out, with a massive payment to cover his debts, but only after he agreed to abandon the marriage and pretend it had never happened. It was a pattern: excess, scandal, outrage, and cleanup, all funded by the public. When his father, George III, began suffering from bouts of incapacitating illness, widely believed to be mental breakdowns, George was appointed Prince Regent in 1811. Essentially, he became king in all but name. It was the perfect opportunity to show the country he could rule with dignity. Instead, he doubled down on theater. He transformed Carlton House into a palace of indulgence. He surrounded himself with sycophants and socialites. He commissioned extravagant architectural projects, including the lavish Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a bizarre mix of Indian and Chinese design, influences that made the press wonder whether the prince was planning to declare himself emperor. Meanwhile, the country was broke. The Napoleonic Wars had drained the treasury. Poverty was rising. Political unrest simmered. Parliament debated reform. The people demanded cheaper bread, fairer wages, and more representation. George, in response, hosted another party. This contrast between royal luxury and national austerity became the defining image of the Regency. Satirists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank had a field day. George became the symbol of decadence, gout, gluttony, and hypocrisy. They drew him as a bloated buffoon, a man too large for his trousers and too vain for his mirror. And the worst part? He kept posing for portraits anyway. By the time he officially became king in 1820, George IV had already alienated much of the public. But then came the Queen Caroline affair, his masterclass in how to lose the crowd completely. Caroline of Brunswick, his lawful wife, married under protest years earlier, had been living abroad. George, determined to prevent her from being crowned alongside him, launched a campaign to strip her of her title and accuse her of adultery. Parliament became the theater for a humiliating public trial. It backfired spectacularly. The public, already sick of George's hypocrisy, rallied behind Caroline. They saw her as mistreated, foreign yet sympathetic, and remarkably poised under pressure. Huge demonstrations broke out in support of the Queen. Protesters filled the streets. Satirical songs and banners mocked the king relentlessly. At one point, crowds booed him as he passed in his carriage, an unprecedented display of royal disrespect. The affair didn't just damage his popularity, it obliterated it. His coronation in 1821, delayed until Caroline died of illness, was a grand, extravagant ceremony. But it played less like a celebration and more like a farce. The press coverage was savage. The mood of the country was grim. Reformist movements were gaining traction. The monarchy looked bloated and obsolete. And at the center of it all stood George, wrapped in ermine, weighted down by diamonds, and openly despised by the people whose taxes had paid for every gem. He spent the final years of his reign increasingly reclusive. His health declined, his debts remained enormous. His relationships with family, ministers, and the public all decayed into mutual irritation. Even his funeral, when it came in 1830, was met with indifference. There was no outpouring of grief, no public mourning, just a quiet closing of the book. What made George IV so hated was not one singular act. It was the sustained performance of entitlement. A man who believed monarchy was an aesthetic, not a responsibility. Who wore the crown like a costume and treated governance like a tedious interruption between costume changes. He wasn't hated because he was evil. He was hated because he was insulting to the times, to the people, and to the very concept of leadership. And yet, even as England laughed at him, the laughter masked a deeper anxiety. Because the next king wasn't foreign in taste or garish in dress. He was foreign in origin. And the people weren't laughing anymore. They were asking, who is this man? And why is he on our throne? 11. George IV. George. I didn't speak much English. He didn't like ceremony. He wasn't interested in pageantry. And he spent as little time in England as he could get away with. For a man who inherited the British throne, he seemed remarkably unimpressed by Britain. In 1714, after the death of Queen Anne, George, Elector of Hanover, was plucked from relative obscurity and dropped onto the English throne like a half-wrapped parcel no one had ordered. He wasn't the most obvious choice. He wasn't English. He wasn't charming. He wasn't even especially involved in British politics prior to his arrival. But he had one powerful qualification that eclipsed all others. He was Protestant. In a country still nursing old wounds from civil war, Catholic terror plots, and the recent deposition of James II, being the right religion mattered more than personality, lineage, or popular appeal. Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, ensuring that no Catholic could ever sit on the throne again. George, though a German prince with minimal connection to England, was Protestant. That made him king. But just because Parliament welcomed him didn't mean the people did. George was foreign in every sense. He spoke primarily German and needed interpreters for most of his communications. His court was filled with German advisors, mistresses, and cooks. He showed little interest in English culture, made minimal effort to endear himself to the public, and preferred his homeland so much that he spent significant time each year in Hanover, leaving his ministers to govern in his absence. This gave the impression, not entirely inaccurate, that England had acquired a part-time monarch. To many of his subjects, George was an outsider imposed by law, not by legitimacy. The Jacobite cause, support for the exiled James Stuart, the Catholic son of James II, gained momentum as a result. Jacobites viewed George as a usurper, and England's constitutional monarchy as a betrayal of divine right and hereditary succession. That tension exploded in 1715 with the First Jacobite Rebellion. Supporters of the exiled Stuart claimant, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, launched an armed uprising in Scotland and parts of northern England. It wasn't just a fringe movement, it was a serious threat, especially in the early months when government forces were stretched and uncertain. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, it revealed how fragile George's grip on the crown truly was. He wasn't loved, he was tolerated, by the political elite, by the Whig-dominated government that benefited from his detachment, and by the financial establishment that valued his reliability. But the broader population? Many saw him as the symptom of a kingdom ruled not by inheritance, but by legislation and convenience. And George did little to soften that image. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't interested in personal diplomacy. He maintained a stiff, private demeanor that reinforced his outsider status. His relationship with his own son, the future George II, was famously bitter, filled with open hostility and public arguments. Their feud became tabloid material of the day, with court factions forming around father and son like rival gangs in powdered wigs. Even his private life fed the gossip mill. George had imprisoned his estranged wife Sophia Dorothea back in Germany on accusations of infidelity and kept two German mistresses in England known as the Maypole and the Elephant, nicknames that were cruel, memorable, and repeated in every satirical pamphlet from London to Edinburgh. Cartoonists and pamphleteers had a field day. They portrayed George as wooden, foreign, and emotionally distant. Unlike later monarchs who were mocked for indulgence, George was mocked for being boring. But beneath the ridicule lay real resentment. Many in Britain, especially Tories, Anglicans, and Jacobite sympathizers, saw George not just as foreign, but as dangerously disconnected. His reliance on German advisors, his absence from the country, and his refusal to engage with the English public all contributed to a growing sense that the monarchy was becoming an abstract institution, hollowed out by parliamentary control and royal indifference. And while Whigs defended him as a stabilizing figure, the image that endured was of a man who reigned but never quite ruled. Yet there's an irony here. George I helped shape the modern British constitutional monarchy, not by design, but by disinterest. Because he cared so little about personal governance, his ministers gained more control. The cabinet system took root. The role of the prime minister began to formalize. Britain, under George's detached eye, started shifting from monarchical rule to parliamentary government. But no one in 1720 was celebrating that slow constitutional evolution. They were too busy muttering about the German king who couldn't pronounce the names of half his own subjects. George died in 1727 on yet another trip to Hanover. He had ruled for 13 years. There was no national outpouring of grief, no dramatic funeral, just a quiet, almost administrative transition to his son, George II. Another Hanoverian, another foreign-sounding name, another king with baggage. George III wasn't hated for what he did. He was hated for what he wasn't. He wasn't present. He wasn't personal. He wasn't English. He was, in many ways, the first modern monarch, hands-off, ceremonial, politically convenient. But in a country still nostalgic for strong, visible kings, or at least ones who showed up to Christmas, he felt like an absentee landlord ruling over a nation that never invited him in. And the next king would discover that being a Protestant wasn't enough to guarantee loyalty. Because when the people believed a foreign monarch had stolen their future, they didn't complain. They plotted. 12. William III as King of England. William III never wanted to be a savior. He wanted to be secure. He wanted to keep France in check, keep Protestantism alive, and keep the Dutch Republic from being steamrolled by the Catholic superpower that was Louis XIV's France. England, for him, was not a love story. It was a battlefield, and he ruled it like one, strategically, defensively, and with the kind of cold calculation that made him invaluable to allies and unnerving to everyone else. When he invaded England in 1688, it wasn't a conquest, not officially. He came with a relatively small army, a carefully worded declaration, and a stack of polite invitations from English nobles begging him to rescue their kingdom from James II, who had made the fatal mistake of being Catholic, politically deaf, and recently the father of a Catholic male heir. The Glorious Revolution, as it would be branded later, had all the trappings of legal process. But make no mistake, it was regime change wrapped in paperwork. William landed on English soil not as a foreign enemy, but as a necessary alternative, and he came ready to be king. But the moment he took the throne, co-ruled with his wife Mary, daughter of the very monarch he had displaced, his popularity began to curdle. Not among the elite, who mostly got what they wanted: Protestant succession, Parliament empowered, and the end of royal absolutism. But among the people, the clergy, and a growing faction of die-hard loyalists to the old regime, William was not a liberator. He was an outsider. He spoke Dutch. He kept a thick accent. He surrounded himself with fellow Dutch advisors. His military campaigns were conducted with the logic of a European general, not an English sovereign. He cared more about funding wars against France than investing in English domestic unity. And though he sat on the throne, he often acted like someone just passing through. That dislocation, that sense that William didn't quite belong, never fully went away. His reign was dominated by war. First against the Irish forces loyal to James II, who attempted a return from exile. Then against Louis XIV, whose power threatened to tip the entire European balance. William dragged England into the 9 Years' War, an expensive and bitter conflict that bled the treasury and exhausted the public. To William, it was a necessary struggle. To many in Parliament and beyond, it felt like a foreign entanglement driven by a foreign king. The taxes increased, the debt mounted, and while William established lasting institutions like the Bank of England and a more modern national debt structure, the resentment followed close behind. He was not charismatic. He was not generous. He was not loved. Satirists called him King Billy, a cold Protestant general who treated the throne like a barracks and the people like chess pieces. His court was austere compared to the flamboyance of the Stuarts. His religious tolerance, especially toward Protestant dissenters, angered the Anglican establishment. And worst of all, to the Jacobites, he was a usurper. The Jacobite movement became more than just political. It became cultural. It painted William as a destroyer of divine order, a symbol of modern corruption, a man who had displaced not just a king, but an entire worldview. Every riot, every pamphlet, every whispered toast to the king over the water was, in some part, a rejection of William. He survived multiple assassination attempts. One of them, in 1696, came close to success. The plot, known as the assassination plot, involved Jacobite sympathizers attempting to ambush him during a hunting trip. The plan failed, but the message landed. William ruled under constant threat, and despite all of this, he kept going. Because William didn't need to be loved, he needed to win. He remained singularly focused on defeating France, preserving Protestant Europe, and keeping the succession Protestant and stable. But even there, fate turned ironic. Mary died in 1694 of smallpox, leaving William to rule alone, still legally co-monarch but now visibly isolated. He had no children. The Stuart line was broken in him. His health began to fail. And the political factions that had once welcomed him began to circle again. By the end of his reign, he was seen less as a man and more as a placeholder. The Act of Settlement in 1701 was passed to ensure that no Catholic could inherit the throne, cutting off dozens of legitimate claimants in favor of the distant German Hanoverians. William didn't oppose it, but it made clear what he had become, a hinge in history, necessary but disposable. He died in 1702 after falling from his horse, ironically named Sorrel, when it stumbled on a molehill. Jacobites toasted the little gentleman in black velvet, a mocking nickname for the mole said to have killed the king. Even in death, he was resented. Historians have tried over the centuries to rehabilitate William III. They point to his role in securing constitutional monarchy, preserving Protestant succession, and resisting French dominance. And those things are true. But they do not erase the deep, persistent unpopularity he endured from vast segments of the population. William was not hated for failure. He was hated for efficiency without warmth, for victory without connection. He ruled like a man fulfilling a job description, and in a kingdom still attached to the idea that monarchy should be personal, should carry something emotional, something magical. William delivered none of it. He governed England like a Dutch fortress, strong, cold, necessary. But the English didn't want a necessary king. They wanted their king. And William never quite passed that test. And yet, even with all the suspicion and bitterness, his reign left a scar deeper than most. Because after William, the throne was no longer about personality. It was about survival, about parliamentary tolerance, about who could rule without collapsing the system. The next royal consort would be despised not for his ambition, but for simply being present. A queen's foreign husband, a Catholic queen's Catholic confidant. And to the English political imagination, there was no one more suspicious than a foreign Catholic who whispered in the ear of the crown. 13. Henrietta Maria of France. Henrietta Maria of France arrived in England in 1625 with a crown on her head, a rosary in her hand, and a target already on her back. She was 15 years old, Catholic, French, and married to a man who barely spoke to her for the first few months of their union. That man, of course, was Charles I, an awkward, art-loving king with a dangerous belief in divine right and a talent for alienating his own subjects. But before Charles would be tried and executed, before civil war would tear England apart, before royalists and parliamentarians would draw their lines in blood and ink, there was Henrietta Maria, queen consort, lightning rod, and, in many eyes, the foreign woman who whispered tyranny into the ear of a doomed king. To understand the hostility toward her, you have to understand the paranoia of the time. England in the early 17th century was a country trembling with religious anxiety. Catholicism wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a national trauma. The Reformation had rewritten the very concept of English identity. Catholics were seen not merely as heretics, but as potential traitors. To many Protestants, Catholicism conjured memories of the Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot, Bloody Mary, and the Inquisition, all rolled into one. So when Charles married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess and the daughter of Henry IV of France, it wasn't just a romantic match. It was a political earthquake. The union was sealed with diplomatic fanfare, but the fine print revealed a compromise that alarmed the English political nation. The Queen would remain Catholic, would be allowed her own chapel, and would bring with her a household full of French Catholic attendants, including priests. To many, it felt like inviting a foreign court into the heart of Westminster. Henrietta Maria, for her part, didn't soften the perception. Young, proud, and steeped in the absolutist culture of the French monarchy, she viewed Protestant England as backward and suspiciously cold. She refused to participate in Anglican services. She clashed with Charles's advisors. She retained a close-knit circle of French confidants and operated her household like a small royal court within a court. In her early years, she was combative, emotional, and politically naive. But she wasn't powerless. Though technically excluded from official government, Henrietta Maria quickly developed influence over court appointments, religious patronage, and foreign diplomacy. She wrote letters to continental rulers, maintained correspondence with the Pope, and lobbied for pro-Catholic policy, all of which were legal, and all of which were ammunition for her critics. And critics she had in abundance. The English press, newly emboldened by a surge in political pamphleteering, began circulating rumors and polemics against her. They accused her of controlling the king, of plotting to restore Catholicism, of harboring traitors in her household. Satirical cartoons depicted her as a puppet master, a shadow queen, a papist spy. In Parliament, members demanded the removal of her French attendants. Charles resisted, then relented. The attendants were sent home, but the damage was done. Henrietta Maria had become a symbol of foreign interference, of Catholic subversion, of everything the Protestant English feared. And then came the personal tragedy that would redefine her image. The death of Charles's most trusted advisor, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1628. Buckingham had been Charles's political shield and his closest friend, some whispered more than a friend. His assassination by a disillusioned soldier created a vacuum of influence at court. Into that vacuum stepped Henrietta Maria. With Buckingham gone, Charles turned increasingly to his wife for counsel. And Henrietta Maria, maturing into her role, embraced it. Over the next decade, her influence grew. She encouraged Charles to take a firmer stance against Parliament. She supported the king's policies of religious uniformity. She defended his prerogatives, and she believed fervently in the divine right of monarchy, just as much as her husband did. To the public, this was confirmation of every fear. The Queen was not merely a foreign Catholic consort. She was a political actor, an enemy within. As tensions escalated between Charles and Parliament, Henrietta Maria became a central villain in the emerging revolutionary narrative. Parliamentarian pamphlets portrayed her as the architect of repression, the secret author of unpopular policies, the queen who poisoned the king's judgment. Her Catholic chapel was described as a center of conspiracy. Her foreign correspondents were painted as agents of sedition. And then came civil war. In 1642, as the country spiraled into conflict, Henrietta Maria fled to the continent, ostensibly to raise funds and support for her husband. In exile, she lobbied the Pope, courted the French crown, and tried to secure arms and allies for the royalist cause. Her efforts were tireless, and in the eyes of Parliament, treasonous. Back in England, her image was now inseparable from the concept of royal tyranny. Parliamentary propaganda accused her of attempting to subjugate England to popery and foreign domination. Her gender and nationality were wielded against her. She was not just the wrong religion, but the wrong kind of woman. Not submissive, but political. Not English, but French. Not silent, but strategic. By the time Charles was captured, tried, and executed in 1649, Henrietta Maria was already politically dead in the eyes of many of her husband's subjects. She lived on in exile, bitter, bereaved, and, as always, unapologetic. She returned to England briefly after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, but she never regained real influence. Modern historians have reassessed her. Some portray her as a devoted wife, a principled queen, even a capable political thinker operating in a hostile environment. But even her defenders acknowledge one unshakable fact. Henrietta Maria was despised by large sections of her adopted country for most of her adult life. She was not merely disliked for what she did. She was feared for what she represented. A Catholic queen at the heart of a Protestant state, a foreign influence in an age of nationalist suspicion. A politically active woman in an age when women were expected to whisper from the wings, not write from the front. And perhaps most dangerous of all, a queen who believed she was right, even when the kingdom was falling apart around her. But if Henrietta Maria's unpopularity came from who she was, the next royal on this list would inherit hatred simply by marrying the wrong man. Because when England's fear of popery collided with dynastic ambition, one woman became the symbol of a nation's paranoia. And when her child was born, the entire country erupted. 14. Mary of Modena. Mary of Modena's greatest sin, in the eyes of Protestant England, was giving birth to a baby. Not just any baby, a Catholic baby, a prince, a potential king. And in that moment, she went from being an unpopular queen consort to the center of a political panic that changed the course of British history. She hadn't asked for this role. She wasn't a schemer. She didn't wield power from behind the throne. She was, by most historical accounts, quiet, devout, and reserved. But history doesn't care about quiet, and England, in the late 17th century, cared even less about Catholic queens who bore male heirs. Born in 1658 to an Italian noble family, Maria Beatrice Anna Margherita Isabella d'Este, Mary of Modena, was a devout Catholic from a ruling house in northern Italy. She was fluent in multiple languages, educated in classical literature, and thoroughly unprepared for the role she would end up playing in English politics. When she was just 15, she was married by proxy to James, Duke of York, the younger brother of King Charles II and the future James II of England. The match was strategic. It secured a Catholic alliance for the Stuarts and bolstered James's standing in Catholic Europe. But the English public didn't see strategy. They saw a Catholic teenage girl entering their royal family during a period of intense religious anxiety. The marriage was not just unpopular, it was inflammatory. From the start, Mary of Modena was viewed with suspicion. She was young, foreign, and devout in a way that made English Protestants deeply uneasy. She traveled with priests. She had her own chapel. She spoke little English and rarely appeared in public without layers of ceremony. Her piety was read not as virtue, but as menace. She didn't even try to soften the optics, perhaps because she didn't believe she had to. Her early years in England were marked by tragedy. Several of her children died in infancy, and for a time it seemed unlikely she would bear a living heir. This fact, ironically, kept tensions in check. A Catholic queen with no surviving child was threatening, but not catastrophic. Protestants could endure her presence as long as the future looked Protestant. That uneasy peace shattered in 1685 when Charles II died and James ascended the throne as James II. Now, Mary was not just a Catholic duchess. She was Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And though she still remained relatively private, her position instantly magnified every fear the English political establishment had been nursing for decades. James II began making moves to lift restrictions on Catholics, allowing them to serve in public office, hold military command, and attend university. He suspended laws against Catholic worship and appointed Catholics to key positions. He framed these decisions as religious toleration. Many saw them as a slow-motion coup. Mary, despite not being politically active in a direct sense, became the symbolic focal point of this perceived Catholic resurgence. Protestant pamphlets accused her of secretly pulling the strings. Sermons warned of the popish queen turning the court into a continental puppet show. Her chaplains, her ladies-in-waiting, her language, her dress, every detail became ammunition in a larger war of religious propaganda. Then, in 1688, the bomb dropped. After years of failed pregnancies, Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the long-awaited heir to the throne. A male child, born of a Catholic queen and a Catholic king, and now placed firmly ahead of James's two Protestant daughters from his previous marriage, Mary and Anne, in the line of succession. The reaction wasn't just fear, it was hysteria. Many Protestants refused to believe the child was real. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. The most notorious claimed that the baby had died at birth and was secretly replaced with a smuggled infant brought into the birthing room hidden in a warming pan. It was absurd. It was unprovable. And it was widely believed. The warming pan baby myth wasn't about logic. It was about panic. England had tolerated a Catholic monarch, barely. It could not tolerate a Catholic dynasty. With a living male heir, the Stuart line suddenly promised decades, possibly centuries, of Catholic monarchs. And that was a future many were simply not willing to accept. Mary became the scapegoat. She was accused not just of scheming to impose Catholicism, but of manufacturing a fake prince to do it. Her devoutness, once merely unsettling, was now framed as dangerous fanaticism. Her foreignness, once a quirk, was now treasonous. And her motherhood, the one duty expected of a queen, became the very reason she was reviled. The crisis reached its breaking point that same year. In November 1688, William of Orange, Mary II's Protestant husband and the Queen's own son-in-law, invaded England with the backing of a significant faction of the political elite. He claimed to come not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of English liberties. Parliament, never fully loyal to James, shifted allegiance. The army followed suit. James fled. The glorious revolution was complete. Mary of Modena, now in exile, followed her husband to France, where they were welcomed at the court of Louis XIV. She would spend the rest of her life in France, living quietly but always under suspicion. Her son, James Francis Edward, the so-called Old Pretender, was raised to believe in his rightful claim to the English throne, and Mary supported him unwaveringly. But England had moved on. The Stuarts became symbols of a past the country was determined not to revisit. Modern historians have taken a softer view of Mary of Modena. She was not a manipulator or a radical. She was a queen consort caught in a political and religious storm she didn't cause and couldn't control. Her devoutness was sincere, her loyalty to her husband unshakable, and her role largely ceremonial. But in an era when symbols mattered more than actions, she became the embodiment of everything England feared: foreignness, Catholicism, absolutism, and dynastic ambition. Her legacy is quiet, buried beneath the louder narratives of her husband and son. But for a brief and explosive period, she was one of the most hated women in the country, not because of what she did, but because of what her son's birth made possible. And yet, England's habit of despising foreign queens was hardly new. Long before Mary of Modena, another royal woman had stirred fear, scandal, and rebellion, not by being Catholic, but by daring to do the unthinkable. She helped depose her own husband. She ruled in his place. And in doing so, she made history. Unfortunately for her, she also made enemies. Enemies who would remember her not as a savior, but as a she-wolf. 15. Isabella of France, as political actor in England. History gave her a name fit for legend: the she-wolf of France. But Isabella of France didn't start off a predator. She was a pawn. Born into one royal family, married into another, traded across the channel like a diplomatic favor wrapped in velvet. And yet, by the time she was finished, she had brought down a king, rewritten England's political order, and built a reputation that lingered for centuries as equal parts seductress, traitor, and revolutionary. She was born around 1295, the daughter of Philip IV of France, nicknamed Philip the Fair for his appearance and feared for his ruthlessness. Isabella grew up in a court where power was inherited but never passive. She was well educated, politically aware, and fully trained in the diplomatic theater of royal life. At age 12, she was married to Edward II of England, forming what was supposed to be a peace treaty in human form. But the English court she married into wasn't just cold, it was already cracking. Her new husband had a king's title, but not a king's temperament. And worst of all, he was already emotionally and politically entangled with a man who had no intention of making room for a queen. Piers Gaveston was Edward's favorite, an ambitious noble who wielded enormous influence, granted titles and lands at lightning speed, and treated Isabella's arrival with something between indifference and open contempt. The court became a battleground for prestige, and Isabella found herself sidelined almost immediately. Still a teenager, she watched as her husband humiliated her position, ignored her political usefulness, and allowed Gaveston to provoke open hostility among the barons. Isabella wasn't just a foreign queen with no power. She was a liability in the eyes of a court already full of faction. But Isabella wasn't naive. She began building quiet alliances, particularly with her French relatives and with English nobles, alienated by Edward's favoritism. She learned to play the long game. When Gaveston was finally executed by rebellious barons in 1312, Isabella did not gloat. She stayed, endured, and waited. And then things got worse. After Gaveston came the Despensers, father and son, who surpassed their predecessor in greed, corruption, and unpopularity. Hugh Despenser the Younger became Edward's new favorite, and with his rise came a campaign of intimidation and land seizure across the kingdom. The Queen's lands were targeted. Her allies were exiled. At one point, Isabella was left nearly penniless, isolated at court, while Despenser and Edward expanded their control. She was still queen, but now she was a hostage in her own palace. Then came her quiet revenge. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV. It was meant to be routine, a symbolic gesture. But Isabella did not return. Instead, she reunited with her son, the heir to the throne, and made a public declaration. She would not come back to England until the Despensers were removed. Edward refused. While in France, Isabella made contact with another exile, Roger Mortimer, a former noble who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to the continent. Their alliance, whether romantic or purely strategic, became one of the most explosive partnerships in English royal history. Together they began gathering forces. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army. Their landing was not welcomed with resistance. It was greeted with support. Years of resentment against Edward and the Despensers boiled over. Nobles defected. Towns opened their gates. The royal army evaporated. Even London rose in their favor. Edward and the Despensers fled. They were captured. The Despensers were executed. Brutally, publicly. Edward was imprisoned. And for the first time in English history, a queen stood at the head of an armed rebellion and took control of the kingdom. But conquest is not the same as consolidation. Isabella installed her son, Edward III, as king, but he was only 14. She ruled as regent, with Mortimer effectively acting as her co-ruler. At first, there was relief, reform, restoration. She reversed many of Edward II's unpopular policies. She redistributed confiscated lands. She held parliament. But the honeymoon didn't last. Mortimer, now elevated beyond any reasonable title, began acting like a king in all but name. His arrogance and appetite for power mirrored the Despensers he had helped destroy. Isabella, by associating so closely with him, began to lose the moral high ground. What had once looked like a righteous uprising now looked like regime swap, and many of the old political patterns returned. Edward III watched, listened, and waited. By 1330, the teenage king had had enough. In a dramatic coup at Nottingham Castle, Edward III personally seized Mortimer. He was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Isabella was spared, but stripped of power and placed under house arrest. She would never rule again. Her fall was swift, but her reputation would unravel more slowly and more viciously. Chroniclers, especially those loyal to Edward III and hostile to Mortimer, began painting Isabella as the true architect of her husband's downfall. She was described as manipulative, unfaithful, power-hungry, a foreign she-wolf who had betrayed both her king and her womanly virtue. Her partnership with Mortimer was sexualized and scandalized. Her invasion was reframed not as liberation, but as usurpation. And the nickname stuck, the she-wolf of France. Modern historians have since taken a more nuanced view. Isabella's actions were extraordinary, but not unprecedented in European politics. Her motives, while ambitious, were rooted in survival and retaliation. She had endured public humiliation, political exile, and the systematic dismantling of her authority. Her uprising was not a power grab. It was a response to powerlessness. Still, the contemporary backlash against her was real. Her unpopularity was not confined to hostile chroniclers. It echoed through Parliament, noble correspondence, and public sentiment. She had dared to overthrow a king, her husband. She had dared to rule, without asking, and she had dared to win, if only briefly. She outlived most of her enemies. She died in relative peace in 1358, having reconciled with her son and witnessed her grandchildren rise in power. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London, beneath an image of her holding Edward II's heart in a silver casket. One last theatrical flourish in a life that defied every expectation of a medieval queen. But the stain of her rebellion never fully faded, because England could forgive war. It could forgive favoritism. It could even forgive tyranny. But it had a harder time forgiving a woman who ruled not through birth or marriage or motherhood, but through force. And if Isabella's story was shaped by rebellion, the next queen on our list would be shaped by civil war. She wasn't foreign, she wasn't French. But to her enemies, she might as well have been. Because when your husband's claim to the throne is questioned, your every word becomes a threat, and your every move becomes a battlefield. 16. Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou didn't marry into peace. She married into a political vacuum. When she arrived in England in 1445 to wed King Henry VI, the court was already divided, the treasury already drained, and the kingdom already teetering on the edge of collapse. But no one knew just how far it would fall, or how much of the blame would fall on her. To her supporters, Margaret was a queen in the mold of medieval France, strong, loyal, fiercely protective of her husband and her son. To her enemies, she was a dangerous foreign influence who hijacked the English crown and plunged the country into civil war. Both versions are true, and neither is the full story. She was born in 1430 in Lorraine, to a noble French family closely connected to the powerful courts of Europe. Her marriage to Henry VI was arranged as part of a fragile truce during the 100 Years' War, one of those political deals that was meant to end a war and instead helped start another. From the moment she landed in England, Margaret had a branding problem. She was French at a time when French meant enemy. The war with France had taken countless English lives, drained the economy, and bred a deep national resentment. Marrying a French princess, especially one whose dowry was not fully paid and whose marriage treaty required England to cede land in France, felt like betrayal in silk gloves. Margaret was also young, barely 15, and entering a court where the king, Henry VI, was incapable of leadership. He was devout, gentle, and pious, but catastrophically unsuited for government. He preferred books and prayer to war and politics. He didn't command armies. He didn't command parliament. At times, he barely commanded his own mind. Margaret saw this, before most others did. And where Henry left a void, she stepped in. Her early years as queen were defined not by pageantry, but by political firefighting. She tried to stabilize a court torn apart by factions, particularly between the Duke of Somerset, who favored continued concessions to France, and the Duke of York, who wanted reform and a more aggressive foreign policy. Margaret aligned with Somerset. York, who had royal blood and a growing base of support, became suspicious of her influence. Their rivalry would become the fault line of the Wars of the Roses. Then in 1453, the crisis exploded. Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. He became unresponsive, catatonic, unable to speak or recognize his own newborn son. For over a year, the king functionally ceased to exist. During this time, the Duke of York was appointed protector of the realm, essentially ruling in Henry's place. Margaret was sidelined. Her child's legitimacy was quietly questioned, and her political instincts hardened into something more aggressive. When Henry recovered in 1454, Margaret moved quickly. She purged York's allies, reinstated her faction, and began to build a network of loyal nobles, dedicated not just to preserving her husband's reign, but to ensuring that her son, Prince Edward, would inherit it. This was the beginning of what her enemies called Queen Margaret's rule. In an England increasingly uneasy about royal favoritism and centralization, Margaret's assertiveness was interpreted as manipulation. Rumors spread that she controlled her husband, that she governed through his weakness, that she would stop at nothing to preserve her own power. The fact that she was a woman, foreign, outspoken, and politically active, only made it easier to cast her as the villain. When open conflict broke out in 1455, Margaret became one of the only women in English history to lead a military faction in her husband's name. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster, her side, and York, the rival claimants, began as a noble power struggle. But as the violence escalated, it transformed into a national blood feud, and Margaret was at the center of it. She wasn't a figurehead. She raised armies, brokered alliances, and negotiated with foreign powers. In a deeply patriarchal society, this alone was enough to make her controversial. But her refusal to compromise, to negotiate with Yorkists, to accept political settlements that excluded her son, hardened opposition against her. The Yorkist press and chroniclers turned her into a caricature. The foreign queen who had corrupted the English crown. The mother who had plunged England into chaos to secure her son's inheritance. The unnatural woman who wielded power with the ruthlessness of a king. By the early 1460s, the tide had turned. After a series of military defeats, Henry was captured, deposed, and briefly restored, each turn of fortune deepening the instability. Margaret fled to Scotland and later to France, fighting from exile to rebuild her faction. Her most dramatic return came in 1471, when she landed in England with a fresh army, only to find within weeks that her husband had been recaptured and her son slain at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Shortly after, Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. Margaret, once the queen, the mother, the general, became a political orphan. She was captured, imprisoned, and eventually ransomed by her French relatives. She spent the remainder of her life in obscurity, dying in 1482 in poverty and near total isolation. And yet, even in death, the hatred lingered. To some, she was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. Foreign interference, dynastic war, female ambition. Her enemies wrote her into the history books as a cautionary tale of queens who rule, of wives who fight, of mothers who refuse to yield. Shakespeare, always happy to turn complex figures into theatrical archetypes, depicted her as a bitter, bloodthirsty specter, cursing the Yorkist kings and howling through the halls of power. But Margaret's unpopularity was never just about her choices. It was about what she represented. She was a foreign queen who dared to act like a native king. She governed in the absence of leadership and then was punished for filling the void. She fought to protect her child's inheritance and was condemned for turning England into a battlefield. Margaret didn't start the Wars of the Roses, but she became its face. Not because she was the most ruthless, but because she was the most visible. And the English have always had a complicated relationship with visibility, especially when it's wielded by a queen. The next royal woman would face similar resentment, not because she overstepped, but because she simply existed as a symbol of foreign favoritism. Her crime wasn't ambition, It was association. And in a city like London, where crowds could turn from curious to violent in seconds, that was more than enough. 17. Eleanor of Provence. Eleanor of Provence didn't ride into England to rule it. She came as a bride, another foreign princess destined to become queen, smile for tapestries, and produce heirs. What she didn't come with was a dowry, or English blood, or, as it turned out, a sense of how quickly Londoners could turn on someone they saw as the wrong kind of queen. She was born around 1223 in the sunlit courts of southern France, the daughter of Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Provence, and Beatrice of Savoy, both steeped in the culture of troubadours, courtly love, and continental politics. Eleanor was intelligent, well-read, and fluent in multiple languages. And at around age 13, she was married off to Henry III of England, a king twice her age and already in political hot water. Henry's reign had started with promise. But by the time Eleanor arrived in 1236, his government was already unpopular, riddled with financial mismanagement, foreign entanglements, and a growing gap between royal spending and actual governance. The arrival of a young, glamorous, and very French queen did not soothe anyone's fears. It inflamed them. Eleanor came with a train of Provençal relatives, brothers, uncles, cousins, who didn't just settle quietly into English life. They wanted lands, titles, influence. And Henry, smitten with his new bride and always eager to expand his court, was happy to oblige. Soon, the Savoyards, Eleanor's extended family, began acquiring castles, incomes, and church positions, often at the expense of English-born nobles. To many barons and city elites, this looked less like diplomacy and more like invasion, not with swords, but with marriage, property law, and court appointments. And at the center of it all was Eleanor, a teenage queen, foreign-born, surrounded by foreign men, smiling while the balance of power shifted. The resentment was not subtle. Chroniclers accused her relatives of corruption and arrogance. Eleanor herself was framed as greedy, manipulative, and indifferent to the customs of her new country. Worse, she was rumored to have mocked English manners and court fashion, only deepening her image as a foreign elite who looked down on the people she was meant to represent. And London, in particular, made its feelings known. The city was no stranger to unrest, but under Henry III, it became a flashpoint of class tension, economic anxiety, and anti-royal sentiment. In this atmosphere, Eleanor became a lightning rod, not for what she did necessarily, but for what she symbolized: favoritism, foreignness, and a queen who seemed to benefit from a king who couldn't manage his kingdom. The anger wasn't limited to the court, it was in the streets. In 1251, Eleanor tried to travel through London by barge along the Thames. It was meant to be ceremonial, a show of royal presence. Instead, it became a full-blown riot. As her barge passed under London Bridge, a mob hurled rotten vegetables, stones, and verbal abuse. According to contemporary accounts, they shouted that she had ruined the kingdom, that she and her foreigners had bled England dry. The Queen of England had to be rescued by the mayor's forces and was escorted back to Westminster in humiliation. That was not an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of an iceberg of growing rebellion. By the mid-1250s, the kingdom was sliding toward civil war. A coalition of barons, led by Simon de Montfort, who, incidentally, was also foreign-born but more politically savvy, began organizing against Henry III. Their complaints were pointed: mismanagement of funds, foreign influence in royal appointments, and the crown's disregard for English customs. Eleanor was not named directly in their documents. She didn't need to be. Everyone knew she was central to the patronage networks they wanted to dismantle. She was also a known player in court politics, lobbying on behalf of her Savoyard relatives and acting as a go-between in foreign diplomacy. When civil war broke out in 1264, Eleanor remained in England, even raising funds for the royalist cause and attempting to rally support for her husband. But after Henry's forces were defeated at the Battle of Lewes, she fled to France for safety, where she would stay for several years, exiled in all but name. Henry would later regain the throne thanks to his son Edward, the future Edward I, but Eleanor's reputation never fully recovered. She returned to England briefly after the war, living a quieter life, increasingly sidelined from politics. Yet even in retirement, the memory of her unpopularity lingered. Chroniclers continued to paint her as ambitious, meddling, and dangerously foreign. Her patronage of French poets and foreign religious orders was framed not as cultural contribution, but as cultural corruption. Her earlier efforts to secure power for her relatives were interpreted as parasitic rather than political. Modern historians have tried to clean up the picture. They've pointed out that many queens brought relatives with them. This wasn't unique to Eleanor. They note that she was a patron of learning, religion, and the arts, that she supported hospitals, religious houses, and public works, that she defended her children's rights fiercely and navigated a deeply hostile court with more resilience than she's often credited for. But none of that changed the fact that, in her own time, she was loathed by many in London and mistrusted by much of the English elite. Her presence at court, however traditional by continental standards, was read as invasive, greedy, and un-English. And once a queen becomes a scapegoat, there's almost no walking it back, especially when her husband isn't helping. Because Henry III, despite all his piety and architectural enthusiasm, managed to alienate almost every major political faction in England during his 56-year reign. And if Eleanor of Provence was hated for her proximity to power, Henry was despised for how he actually used it. And the barons weren't just whispering anymore, they were raising armies. 18. Henry III. If Eleanor of Provence was a queen who attracted hatred by association, her husband Henry III earned his share the old-fashioned way, by ruling badly, often, and for a very long time. Reigning from 1216 to 1272, Henry III holds the record as one of England's longest-serving monarchs. And for much of that time, he was, in the politest possible terms, widely considered a failure. Not because he was a tyrant or a monster, or even particularly violent, but because he managed to embody almost everything the political elite hated about medieval kingship, without the one thing that could redeem it: effectiveness. Henry inherited the throne at just 9 years old, in the immediate aftermath of a civil war against his father, King John. The country was bruised, the barons restless, and Magna Carta was already the battered symbol of resistance to royal overreach. Henry's early reign was dominated by regents and advisors who tried to keep the peace, rebuild trust, and keep the young king alive long enough to reach adulthood without sparking another rebellion. For a while it worked. But once Henry came of age and took the reins of power, things began to unravel. His personality was not the problem. Henry was personally devout, gentle in manner, and interested in art, architecture, and theology. He was deeply pious, almost to the point of detachment from political reality, and far more likely to build a chapel than a castle. In another time and place, he might have made a respectable bishop. But Henry wasn't a bishop. He was King of England, and his subjects expected him to act like one. Unfortunately, Henry lacked most of the core traits needed to keep his kingdom stable. He was indecisive in politics, erratic with money, and astonishingly prone to surrounding himself with unpopular advisors, particularly foreign ones. Over and over again, he handed out power and privilege to friends and relatives who had little connection to England's political establishment, creating a sense that the king's court was less a government and more a very exclusive club for outsiders. It didn't help that many of these favorites were relatives of his wife, Eleanor of Provence, Savoyards, Lusignans, and assorted continental courtiers who arrived in England expecting lands, income, and titles, and often received them. To the English barons, this wasn't just nepotism, it was treasonous indulgence. But if favoritism caused frustration, Henry's financial policies turned it into fury. His building projects, especially the lavish reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, drained the royal treasury. His costly attempts to secure the Sicilian crown for one of his sons, a fantasy foreign adventure bankrolled by English taxes, were seen as delusional and reckless. Time and again, he requested money from Parliament. Time and again, Parliament said no. But Henry kept spending anyway. The result? A spiral of debt, discontent, and distrust. By the 1250s, the discontent had metastasized into political resistance. The barons, led by Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, ironically, demanded reforms. They wanted limitations on royal authority, stricter controls on spending, and a say in appointments. In 1258, they forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, a sweeping set of reforms that effectively made the monarchy accountable to a council of barons. Henry agreed, and then, almost immediately, began plotting to undo it. This duplicity infuriated his opponents. Trust between king and nobility collapsed. What followed was a decade of political instability, marked by bitter negotiations, foreign arbitration, and eventually, civil war. The conflict came to a head in 1264, when royal forces clashed with rebel barons at the Battle of Lewes. Henry was captured. His son, Prince Edward, was taken hostage. Simon de Montfort became the de facto ruler of England. For over a year, he governed in the king's name, introducing reforms, expanding parliamentary representation, and trying to create a constitutional framework for monarchy. But Henry's son didn't share his father's passivity. In 1265, Prince Edward escaped captivity, rallied royalist forces, and defeated Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. Montfort was killed. His body was mutilated, displayed as a warning. Henry was restored to power, and the monarchy reasserted itself. But the scars of rebellion lingered. England had tasted civil war, and it had tasted what a limited monarchy could look like. Henry, predictably, learned very little from the experience. In the final years of his reign, he remained stubbornly attached to his favorites, continued his costly building projects, and struggled to restore the crown's finances. He spent more time on religious devotion and symbolic gestures than on reform or reconciliation. By the time he died in 1272, many were simply relieved that his son, Edward I, would finally take the throne and bring energy and discipline to a kingdom long starved of both. And yet, for all his failings, Henry III was not hated in the way other kings were. He wasn't overthrown. He wasn't murdered or exiled. He didn't plunge the country into sustained chaos. Instead, he was resented, quietly, deeply, and for a very long time. He became a symbol not of tyranny, but of ineptitude. The king who could never quite lead, who could never quite control his court, who could never quite say no to the wrong people or yes to the right ones. His reign was a slow, smoldering disillusionment, a half-century of missed opportunities, broken promises, and political exhaustion. And while he died in his bed, his memory didn't rest so easily. Because to the barons who had risked everything for reform, to the Londoners who had been taxed without results, to the English nobility who watched their power eroded by court favoritism, Henry III wasn't just a weak king. He was a warning. But long before Henry wore the crown, England had already endured another monarch whose reign was marked by chaos, not because he was weak, but because no one could quite decide whether he was king at all. His name was Stephen, and his kingdom was anarchy. 19. Stephen. Stephen of Blois wasn't supposed to be king. But then again, medieval England wasn't exactly known for sticking to the script, especially when there was a throne up for grabs and everyone in the room thought they had a better claim. In Stephen's case, he didn't just grab the crown. He slipped it on before anyone else could, smiled politely, and hoped no one would notice the chaos unfolding behind him. The year was 1135. King Henry I had died without a surviving legitimate son. His only legitimate heir was his daughter Matilda, also known as Empress Matilda because of a politically convenient marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor. Before his death, Henry had made all his barons swear fealty to her, multiple times in fact, just to be safe. But oaths, like crowns, tend to get a little blurry when power is in play. Enter Stephen. He was Henry's nephew, a noble of considerable charm, money, and, crucially, proximity. While other contenders hesitated, Stephen moved fast. He sailed to England, secured support from key churchmen, especially the influential Archbishop of Canterbury, and was crowned king within weeks. Legitimacy? Debatable. Strategy? Flawless. For a moment, it seemed like the gamble might pay off. Stephen was generous, affable, and good at winning allies, at first. But charisma can only go so far when your claim to the throne rests on the assumption that no one will challenge you. Matilda did, and what followed was nearly 2 decades of intermittent civil war, shifting loyalties, sieges, and regional unrest, a period so chaotic it earned its own nickname, the Anarchy. Chroniclers described it with classic understatement: Christ and his saints slept. Translation: the country was a mess and no one knew who was in charge. Stephen's main problem wasn't just that he had rivals. It was that his rule never felt entirely secure. The nobility, unsure which side would win, hedged their bets. Castles were built without permission. Local lords became warlords. Law and order collapsed in large parts of the kingdom. The economy withered, and Stephen, for all his initial popularity, seemed unable or unwilling to restore control. His leadership style didn't help. Stephen was famously indecisive when it mattered most, alternating between conciliatory gestures and sudden bursts of aggression. He pardoned enemies only to fight them again months later. He relied on favorites who were widely mistrusted. And perhaps most critically, he failed to keep the powerful clergy on his side. A fatal misstep in an era when the church was as much a political machine as a spiritual one. Meanwhile, Matilda wasn't exactly charming the crowds either. Her claim was strong, her cause just, and her supporters passionate, but she struggled with public opinion. Aristocratic, headstrong, and politically assertive, she was often portrayed as overbearing and foreign in style. When she briefly took control of London in 1141, her behavior was so unpopular that the citizens rose up and drove her out. In this civil war, even temporary victory seemed to backfire. Stephen's fortunes rose and fell like the tides. In 1141, he was captured in battle and imprisoned. Matilda seemed poised to finally take the crown, but her failure to be crowned and consolidate power allowed Stephen's supporters to regroup. A prisoner swap restored him to the throne. The stalemate continued. No one could win. No one could govern. For ordinary people, it was a nightmare. Raiding, feuding, and endless instability turned vast areas of England into lawless zones. Nobles built unauthorized castles to protect their fiefdoms or exploit them. Local justice was often administered by whoever had the most swords. Trade routes were unsafe, crops were destroyed, and the monarchy, once the symbol of divine order, was now a source of dysfunction. By the 1150s, both Stephen and Matilda were aging. The conflict was no longer about them, it was about legacy. Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, emerged as the next major contender. Young, ambitious, and militarily capable, he inherited not only his mother's claim, but also substantial lands in France. He invaded England in 1153, not with overwhelming force, but with enough momentum to convince people that the end might finally be near. By this point, even Stephen seemed ready to stop fighting. His own son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly that same year, removing one of the major obstacles to a compromise. That winter, Stephen agreed to the Treaty of Winchester. Henry would be recognized as his heir, and civil war would, in theory, end. Stephen died in 1154, and Henry, soon to be known as Henry II, took the throne without resistance. Stephen's reign then was sandwiched between two far more decisive rulers: his uncle Henry I, who brought order and legal reform, and his successor, Henry II, who restored strong kingship. Between them stood Stephen, a monarch, remembered not for tyranny or reform, but for presiding over a vacuum. He wasn't hated for being evil. He was despised for being ineffective. To his critics, Stephen represented the failure of monarchy to fulfill its basic promise, to provide security, order, and justice. His inability to control his nobles, enforce his authority, or secure a peaceful succession left England broken and disillusioned. Chroniclers didn't call him a villain, they called him a weak king. And that, in medieval political terms, might have been worse. Modern historians have tried to rehabilitate his image slightly. They point out that his initial support base was genuine, that he wasn't a usurper in the traditional sense, just someone who saw an opportunity and took it. That he fought hard to maintain a crumbling kingdom with limited tools. But even those more sympathetic views usually end with a sigh. Stephen meant well, they say. He just wasn't up to the job. And yet, for all his chaos, he was never quite the villain of the story. That role would be reserved for the next figure, a woman whose brief grip on power left behind a trail of political panic, broken alliances, and a public reputation as cold as her coronation day wasn't. Because if Stephen's crime was ruling badly, Empress Matilda's was wanting to rule it all. 20. Empress Matilda, Lady of the English. Empress Matilda spent her entire adult life being told two contradictory things. First, that she was the rightful heir to the English throne, and second, that she was absolutely not allowed to behave like one. She was born around 1102, the only legitimate surviving child of King Henry I. In a world obsessed with male succession, this made her both indispensable and inconvenient. Her father raised her with the expectation of rule, educated her, married her strategically, paraded her authority before the barons of England. Then, when he died, the same barons who had sworn to support her succession quietly decided they preferred literally anyone else, including Stephen. Matilda's claim was legally strong. She had been publicly designated as heir. Oaths had been sworn. Documents had been signed. But medieval politics was not a courtroom. It was a performance. And Matilda, for all her legitimacy, failed the performance test at the exact moment it mattered most. By the time she arrived in England to press her claim, Stephen was already crowned. The church had blessed him. The nobles had rallied, at least publicly. The momentum was gone. But Matilda didn't give up. She couldn't. Her entire identity had been shaped around the assumption that the throne was hers by right. What followed was not a rebellion in the modern sense. It was a prolonged legitimacy crisis, where two rulers existed simultaneously and the country fractured around them. Matilda's greatest asset, her certainty, was also her greatest liability. She did not ask for support. She expected it. She did not negotiate. She asserted. Her style was imperial, inherited from her time as Holy Roman Empress, where authority was displayed, not debated. But England was not the empire. It was a feudal pressure cooker, where consensus mattered more than titles. And Matilda struggled with that reality. When her forces captured Stephen in 1141, the moment she had waited for finally arrived. The king was imprisoned. London lay open. The crown was within reach. Matilda took the title Lady of the English, a deliberate assertion of sovereignty. Not queen, not regent, ruler. And then she lost it. Her behavior in London was catastrophic. She demanded heavy taxes. She refused to grant favors. She dismissed petitions. She spoke sharply to city leaders who expected negotiation and reassurance. To Matilda, these demands were normal exercises of authority. To Londoners, they felt like the opening act of tyranny. The city turned on her almost immediately. Crowds gathered, resistance flared, and before she could be crowned, Matilda was forced to flee. Her coronation evaporated. Stephen's supporters regrouped. The window closed. From that moment on, Matilda's reputation never recovered. Her enemies portrayed her as arrogant, cold, and imperious. Traits that, in a male ruler, might have been tolerated or even admired. In a woman, they became evidence of unfitness. Chroniclers emphasized her sharp tongue, her refusal to compromise, her failure to charm. The fact that she behaved like a ruler became proof in the public imagination that she should never be one. The Civil War dragged on for years after that failed coronation. Matilda continued to fight, negotiate, and maneuver, but her personal authority weakened. Gradually, the struggle shifted from her to her son, Henry of Anjou, a younger, more flexible claimant who had learned from her mistakes. By the early 1150s, Matilda was no longer trying to be crowned. She was trying to secure her son's future. And in that, she succeeded. When Stephen agreed to recognize Henry as his heir, the war finally wound down. England would get a king, just not her. Matilda lived to see her son crowned Henry II in 1154, inaugurating the Angevin dynasty and restoring strong monarchy to England. In a bitter irony, she achieved through motherhood what she could not achieve through right. So why was she despised? Not because she caused the Civil War. That honor belongs to Stephen's opportunism as much as her insistence. Not because she was uniquely cruel or incompetent, but because she violated expectations without softening the blow. She demanded power without pretending she didn't want it. She ruled without apology. And in a society that tolerated female authority only when disguised as humility, that was unforgivable. Even sympathetic chroniclers struggled with her. They praised her intelligence, her resolve, her legitimacy, then quietly noted that she lacked feminine grace, that she was too proud, that she did not bend. Modern historians tend to be kinder. They see Matilda as a woman trained for rule in a system that rejected her the moment she tried to exercise it. They note that her policies were not radically different from male contemporaries, that her expectations were shaped by precedent, not ego, that her failure was less personal than structural. But contemporary opinion was brutal. To many in England, Matilda was not the rightful heir denied her crown. She was the near queen who almost ruled, and frightened them by how little she seemed to care whether they approved. Her story haunted the English monarchy. For generations, it was cited as proof that female rule was dangerous, divisive, and destabilizing. And even centuries later, echoes of her failure shaped how queens would be judged, expected to rule indirectly, softly, through husbands or sons. Matilda did none of that. She stood in the open and claimed the crown, and England recoiled. But if her unpopularity came from ambition without compromise, the next king on our list would earn his resentment the opposite way, by being present, crowned, and entirely unable to impose order. A king whose reign became synonymous with chaos. A king remembered not for what he demanded, but for what he failed to stop. 21. Henry VI. If Empress Matilda was resented for being too assertive, Henry VI would go down in history for being almost entirely the opposite. In fact, if you had to design a monarch to demonstrate what happens when authority exists in name only, Henry VI would be your prototype. He was crowned. He was blessed. He ruled for decades, and almost no one, at any point, believed he was actually in charge. The child of a warrior king, Henry V, and the last direct Lancastrian monarch before the house began to unravel, Henry VI inherited the throne in the most precarious way possible, as an infant. He was just 9 months old when his father died in 1422, leaving England still entangled in the 100 Years' War and still occupying much of northern France. Technically, Henry was also King of France thanks to his grandfather's political maneuvering, but that was mostly on parchment. What he inherited was not an empire, but a countdown. His early reign was managed by regents and protectors, who made the usual solemn pledges about defending the kingdom, preserving the peace, and someday handing over a crown intact. That didn't happen. By the time Henry came of age, France had turned the tide. Joan of Arc's campaigns had emboldened the French monarchy, and the English territories began to shrink. Slowly at first, then quickly. But losing France wasn't the main reason Henry VI was so deeply unpopular. His problem was internal, structural, psychological. even spiritual, some said. Henry was pious, painfully, devotedly pious. His interests were religious contemplation, education, and spiritual purity. He founded colleges, notably Eton and King's College, Cambridge, and prayed often. These would be noble traits in a monk. In a medieval king facing rebellion, corruption, and dynastic instability, less helpful. The court around him fractured into factions. Noble families began treating the crown as a neutral prize to fight over rather than a source of order. Henry watched it happen, sometimes literally, and issued few commands to stop it. He trusted advisors who were widely mistrusted. He ignored conflicts until they escalated. His court became notorious for favoritism, infighting, and a complete lack of direction. By the late 1440s, people were starting to panic. Soldiers returning from France were angry. Trade was unstable. Taxation was high. The political class had no confidence in the crown's ability to handle unrest. And the countryside began to boil. In 1450, a major rebellion erupted in Kent. Known as Jack Cade's Rebellion, it was not a peasant uprising in the traditional sense. It was a pointed political protest against the king's advisors, his failure to protect English territories, and the general decay of governance. Cade's rebels marched on London, issued formal demands, and even executed unpopular officials. It was a sign of just how bad things had gotten. Henry responded by fleeing the capital and offering pardons. A pattern he would repeat again and again. Disappearance in the face of crisis, followed by vague offers of forgiveness and little real consequence. But even more destabilizing than rebellion was the king's own mind. In 1453, Henry VI suffered a complete mental collapse. For over a year, he was unresponsive, incapable of speech, recognition, or rulership. During this period, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, gave birth to their only son, Edward. Henry had no reaction to the birth. None. And in a political environment already defined by factionalism and doubt, the king's visible absence only intensified the scramble for control. Who would govern in his name? Who could be trusted? Was the prince even legitimate? The nobility turned to Richard, Duke of York, a powerful figure with royal blood and a plausible claim to the throne. He was appointed protector of the realm during Henry's episode. But when Henry partially recovered in 1454, Margaret and her faction worked to remove York from power. The resulting political whiplash tore the realm into two camps: Lancastrian loyalists versus Yorkist challengers. Civil war followed. The Wars of the Roses weren't just a dynastic struggle. They were a public referendum on whether Henry VI could continue as king. His reign became synonymous with drift. He was captured and restored multiple times. He was a monarch in name only, a shadow passed between factions as a symbol of legitimacy. Crowds did not rally around him. Parliament did not fear him. Armies fought over him, but rarely for him. Even during his brief restoration in 1470, when he was technically king again, Henry was little more than a figurehead propped up by nobles who needed a justification for their latest alliance. He reportedly spent much of that time in quiet prayer, disconnected from the brutal power politics happening in his name. He died in 1471, after Edward IV reclaimed the throne. The official line was natural causes. The popular rumor was, less kind. But even in death, Henry VI didn't inspire fear. He inspired pity and frustration, and a quiet, gnawing relief that the era of royal passivity might finally be over. So why is he on a list of the most despised? Because his failures weren't just personal. They were institutional. His inability to lead turned England into a battlefield. His detachment empowered warlords. His weakness didn't just invite conflict, it became its fuel. And the political class, the citizens, the soldiers, they all knew it. They didn't hate him for cruelty. They resented him for watching the country fall apart and doing nothing. They called his reign a tragedy. But no one called it unjustly interrupted. And yet even a weak king can inspire sympathy. which is more than can be said for the next royal, whose presence in English political life sparked fear, outrage, and a dramatic showdown that ended not with reform or resignation, but with a scaffold. 22. Mary, Queen of Scots. In English political life, Mary, Queen of Scots, never ruled England, and yet, for nearly 20 years, she haunted it. She was a presence without a crown, a prisoner without chains, a monarch whose very existence destabilized another monarch's throne. To her supporters, she was the rightful queen unjustly denied her inheritance. To her enemies, she was a walking catastrophe, an alternative future that could not be allowed to exist. And to Elizabeth III's government, Mary was the most dangerous thing imaginable, a symbol powerful enough to ignite rebellion without lifting a finger. Mary was born in 1542, already a queen before she could speak. Crowned Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old, she grew up largely in France, raised as a Catholic royal in one of Europe's most sophisticated courts. She married the French Dauphin, briefly becoming Queen of France as well, before widowhood sent her back to Scotland, a country that had changed dramatically in her absence. Scotland had embraced Protestant reform. Mary had not. Her return in 1561 was tense, but initially workable. She ruled with surprising restraint, tolerating Protestant governance while maintaining her Catholic faith privately. But her personal choices quickly eroded that fragile balance. Her marriages, first to her cousin Lord Darnley, then to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, triggered scandal, factionalism, and outrage. Darnley's murder, widely believed to involve Bothwell and suspected by many to implicate Mary herself, destroyed her credibility. In 1567, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, and imprisoned by her own nobles. At this point, Mary made the decision that sealed her fate. She fled south to England in 1568, seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I. Instead, she walked into captivity. To Elizabeth, Mary was not just a relative in need. She was a political nightmare. Mary was Catholic in a Protestant kingdom. She had a strong, dynastic claim to the English throne, stronger, in the eyes of many Catholics, than Elizabeth's own. And she was young, charismatic, and fertile in an era obsessed with succession. From the moment Mary crossed the border, she became a magnet for conspiracy. Catholic powers across Europe viewed her as a potential replacement for Elizabeth. English Catholics, marginalized and increasingly desperate, rallied around her as a figure of hope. Rebellions erupted in her name, not because she commanded them, but because she existed. The Northern Rising of 1569, led by Catholic nobles, aimed to free Mary and marry her into English power. It failed, but it terrified the Elizabethan state. Papal declarations followed, questioning Elizabeth's legitimacy and implicitly endorsing Mary's claim. Plot after plot began to swirl. Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington. Some were elaborate, some were amateurish. All were dangerous. Mary's role in these plots remains fiercely debated. She was, at minimum, reckless. She corresponded with supporters, entertained foreign alliances, and failed to grasp how closely she was being watched. At worst, she actively endorsed plans to overthrow Elizabeth. Either way, her captivity grew stricter, her reputation darker. To the English public, Mary transformed from tragic queen to existential threat. Pamphlets portrayed her as manipulative, seductive, and treacherous. Protestant writers painted her as the embodiment of Catholic menace, a woman whose charm masked political destruction. Every crisis Elizabeth faced seemed somehow to circle back to Mary's shadow. Elizabeth hesitated, for years. Executing an anointed queen, especially one who was her cousin, was unthinkable, dangerous, precedent-setting. Elizabeth feared the moral and political consequences, not just at home, but across Europe. If queens could be legally killed, what protection did monarchy have at all? But patience erodes under pressure. The Babington Plot in 1586 finally forced the issue. Intercepted letters appeared to show Mary approving a plan that included Elizabeth's removal. Whether Mary fully understood the implications or was maneuvered into incriminating herself mattered less than the fact that the evidence existed. She was put on trial, not as a foreign monarch, not as a queen, but as a subject accused of treason. The verdict was inevitable. Mary was executed in 1587, calm, dignified, defiant to the end. She died insisting she was a martyr to her faith and her claim. And in death, she became more powerful than she had ever been in life. Catholic Europe mourned her. Protestant England exhaled. But the damage lingered. Mary's long imprisonment radicalized English politics. It hardened religious divisions. It convinced Elizabeth's government that mercy was weakness, and that threats must be eliminated, not managed. And it left behind a troubling legacy, that the English state could destroy a royal rival through law, surveillance, and patience. Mary, Queen of Scots, was despised not because she ruled England badly, but because she might have ruled it at all. She represented instability in human form. A reminder that legitimacy is fragile, that bloodlines compete, and that crowns can be claimed without armies. And in the end, England decided it was safer without her. But the fear she embodied didn't die with her, because the next king would inherit a country that had learned to mock its monarch, protest its wars, and question its authority, not in whispers or plots, but in the open streets. And this time, the crown wouldn't be threatened by a rival queen. It would be challenged by its own people. 23. George III, late reign public hostility episodes. George III is a figure split down the middle, half national symbol, half political punching bag. To some, he's the mad king who lost America and talked to trees. To others, he's the stoic monarch who endured illness with dignity and helped shepherd Britain through war and revolution. The truth is murkier and less comforting. Because before the myths hardened into legend, George III was, at various points, one of the most publicly disliked men in the kingdom he ruled. Unlike some of the earlier monarchs on this list, George III wasn't hated because he abused power or courted scandal. In fact, his personal life was remarkably unscandalous. He was a devoted husband, had 15 children, and rejected the libertine lifestyle favored by previous Hanoverian kings. But in politics, perception is everything, and George's reign was long enough and turbulent enough to swing public opinion against him more than once. He came to the throne in 1760, a 22-year-old king determined to break from the habits of his predecessors. He famously declared that he gloried in the name of Britain, signaling his desire to be a more involved domestic monarch, less reliant on the old Whig political machine. Admirable in theory, but in practice this led to years of political instability as ministries rose and fell under the pressure of royal preference and parliamentary resistance. Still, George remained relatively popular with the public until the colonies started burning. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, marked the first major rupture between George and a significant portion of his subjects. Though Parliament passed the unpopular taxes and enforced the policies that ignited rebellion, it was George III who became the symbolic villain in American revolutionary propaganda. He was caricatured as a tyrant, mocked in pamphlets, and written into the Declaration of Independence as a sovereign who had abdicated government here. That was abroad. But at home, the war soured perceptions too, especially as it dragged on, grew costly, and ended in humiliating defeat. The loss of the American colonies was not merely a military failure. It was a symbolic collapse of imperial confidence, and many saw George as the man who presided over that fall. Public trust faltered, protest grew, and satire flourished. The 1780s saw the rise of a more vocal, more organized radical opposition in England itself. Figures like John Wilkes had already tapped into anti-establishment sentiment, and by now the political environment was increasingly defined by calls for reform, cheaper government, and accountability. George's association with the old order, aristocracy, closed politics, privilege, made him a natural target. Crowds didn't just grumble, they demonstrated. Effigies of the king were burned. Satirical cartoons multiplied. In cities like London and Birmingham, the streets became theaters of protest. George III wasn't despised all the time, everywhere, but in moments of political crisis, the hostility was real and it was visible. One particularly telling episode came during the Gordon riots of 1780, when anti-Catholic sentiment exploded into days of violent unrest in London. Though not directly caused by the king, the riots exposed the government's fragility and public frustration. The monarchy, once seen as the stabilizing force, was now part of the problem. And then came the French Revolution. When the French monarchy collapsed in the 1790s, British radicals drew inspiration. They didn't want guillotines, they wanted voting rights, constitutional reform, freedom of the press. And for them, George III was the face of resistance to change. Loyalist mobs clashed with reformers. The government cracked down on speech and assembly. In this atmosphere, the king's image hardened into a reactionary one. He wasn't portrayed as cruel. He was portrayed as obsolete. In 1800, during a royal theater visit, a man attempted to shoot the king. He missed. The public reaction was mixed. There was outrage, certainly, but there were also those who interpreted the attack as a symptom of a kingdom on edge. And then, just when George III might have been able to pivot back into favor, his health failed him. Beginning in the late 1780s and worsening by the 1810s, the king suffered from bouts of mental illness that left him unfit to rule. During these episodes, he reportedly rambled incoherently, behaved erratically, and was confined from public view. The Regency Act of 1811 formally handed power to his son, the future George IV, himself no beacon of popularity. George III spent the last decade of his reign effectively isolated, blind, and deeply unwell. By then, he was no longer hated. He was a ghost. His image softened in the public mind, recast as tragic and pitiable. But the episodes of earlier hostility, over war, over reform, over identity, remained part of the historical record. Modern historians have reevaluated him. They point out his intellectual curiosity, his dedication to duty, his cultural contributions. But in his own time, George III faced sustained, sometimes intense public hostility. Not because he was evil, but because he became the symbol of everything his subjects wanted to protest: war, debt, repression, and stagnation. His unpopularity was never total. It was circumstantial, episodic, political. But it mattered. Because when a monarch becomes the lightning rod for a nation's frustrations, it's not always tyrants who draw the spark. Sometimes it's the man who prays quietly, reads farming journals, and does his best to look steady in a storm he can't quite control. And yet even George's worst days did not inspire calls for abolition. The monarchy would survive him. But the next queen on our list, early in her reign, discovered just how thin the line was between popularity and protest. All it took was one scandal, one advisor, one angry headline. And suddenly, even an empire's favorite granddaughter could be mocked in the streets. 24. Queen Victoria, early reign unpopularity pockets. It's hard to imagine Queen Victoria as anything other than the stern, black-clad matriarch of empire, widowed, unamused, and frozen in portraits like a national monument with a pulse. But before she became the embodiment of moral propriety and imperial confidence, Victoria was a teenage queen with a public relations problem. She inherited the throne in 1837 at just 18, replacing her aging uncle William IV. The public was intrigued. A young female monarch? Romantic, unprecedented, almost revolutionary. She was youthful, intelligent, and charismatic in an era that had grown weary of bumbling Hanoverian kings and their late-life dynasties. The transition felt like a breath of fresh, orderly air. At first. Then the air turned political. Victoria wasn't yet experienced enough to understand how factional politics operated, or how a queen's personal circle could become a national liability. But that's exactly what happened. At the heart of the early hostility she faced was her relationship with one man, Sir John Conroy, the ambitious and divisive advisor to her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Conroy had spent Victoria's entire childhood preparing her mother to act as regent, confident, maybe even counting on the idea that Victoria wouldn't be of age when William IV died. When the king lingered long enough for Victoria to inherit as a legal adult, Conroy's plans collapsed. Victoria refused to grant him any power. She distrusted him, disliked him, and, most significantly, made no effort to disguise it. The public didn't mourn his departure from influence. But the affair fed a growing narrative about palace intrigue, manipulative advisors, and a young queen's judgment. Newspapers, always eager to fill in the blanks, began to turn. The real blow came in 1839, during a relatively minor but deeply symbolic scandal, the bedchamber crisis. The situation was, on the surface, absurdly polite. The Whig Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, whom Victoria trusted deeply, resigned after losing support in Parliament. His rival, Conservative leader Robert Peel, was invited to form a government, but Peel requested that some of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, who were closely aligned with the Whigs, be replaced. Victoria refused. The fallout was swift. Peel declined to serve. Melbourne returned, and the young queen found herself accused of partisanship, obstinacy, and immaturity. Tory newspapers erupted. The crown was supposed to remain above politics, but here was the monarch refusing a government over court appointments. What appeared to be an issue of personal loyalty was framed as constitutional irresponsibility. Crowds turned out, not to cheer, but to question. Whispers grew louder. Was the queen simply naive, or was she already captive to one faction? The narrative of a Whig queen stuck, however unfairly. And for the first time, Victoria discovered what it meant to lose control of the story. Worse still, the early 1840s weren't exactly a golden age for public affection. Economic instability, high unemployment, and industrial unrest fueled anger across the kingdom. The Chartist movement was gathering steam, demanding electoral reform, universal male suffrage, and an end to aristocratic dominance. To radicals and working-class critics, the monarchy was part of the old order, a symbol of inherited privilege, increasingly at odds with modern demands. Victoria's image, still forming, became a target of satire and protest. She wasn't mocked for extravagance. She wasn't yet extravagant. She wasn't criticized for corruption. She wasn't yet wielding much power. But she was criticized for being there, a monarch in a time when more and more people were asking what monarchs were for. Then came her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. A German prince, chosen partly for diplomatic balance and partly because he seemed to match Victoria in intellect and temperament. But if the public was ambivalent about Victoria's early style, they were openly suspicious of Albert. To many, he represented foreign interference, a meddling consort, a soft-spoken outsider who didn't understand British politics and didn't belong in British governance. It didn't help that Victoria adored him and deferred to him in private and sometimes in public matters. Rumors that Albert was secretly influencing policy spread quickly. Cartoons depicted him pulling Victoria's strings. The xenophobic press labeled him a parasite. And through it all, Victoria had to learn, on the job, how to perform monarchy. She had to navigate a country that was industrializing faster than any in the world. That was becoming literate, politicized, and increasingly restless. Where newspapers could now destroy reputations overnight. Where monarchs could no longer expect deference without performance. She learned quickly. She took on more symbolic duties, made carefully, choreographed public appearances, managed her image through portraiture and ceremonial display. Over time, she and Albert worked hard to transform the monarchy into a moral institution, focused on family, duty, and continuity. The shift worked. But it was not instant. For years, Victoria faced a current of skepticism, especially during moments of political crisis or labor unrest. The working classes didn't rally to her side. Reformers didn't trust her. Even when she wasn't personally disliked, she was institutionally unpopular. The real turning point came much later, after Albert's death in 1861, and after her long period of mourning. But in these early years, the Queen walked a narrow line between fascination and frustration. Victoria was not despised in the way others on this list were. There were no uprisings in her name, no organized rebellions, but her popularity was fragile, conditional, and deeply shaped by class and press. She was not born into hatred, but she had, to earn affection, and before she became the empress of half the world, she had to survive being the girl who wouldn't change her ladies-in-waiting. Still, for all her early stumbles, Victoria endured. Unlike the next royal, her husband, who would spend much of his life trying to outrun one label, the foreign prince who didn't belong. 25. Prince Albert. Before he was the marble-faced icon of Victorian respectability, before the exhibitions and institutions bore his name in quiet tribute, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was, to much of the British public, an interloper with suspicious cheekbones and an accent they didn't trust. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. He married the Queen, after all. Albert arrived in England in 1840, not as a conqueror or a contender, but as the carefully vetted suitor of Queen Victoria, chosen from a short list of Protestant princes, acceptable to the balance of power politics that shaped royal matchmaking in the 19th century. He was German, well-read, serious, and alarmingly earnest. Victoria loved him almost immediately. The public, not so much. The problem wasn't just that Albert was foreign. It was how foreign he seemed. He didn't come with swagger or sparkle. He didn't host lavish parties or throw coins to children in the streets. He read dry books on constitutional theory. He disliked hunting. He spoke English with a mild but noticeable accent. And worst of all, he seemed interested in government. To a British public still suspicious of royal influence after the Georgian era, this was almost a provocation. Albert had no official constitutional role, but the court was his laboratory. He advised Victoria on state papers, offered suggestions on foreign policy, and, though always from behind the curtain, became a key figure in royal decision-making. He reorganized the court budget. He championed science and industrial progress. He even tried to influence moral reform movements. None of this went over well with the popular press. Cartoonists in publications like Punch took aim at the foreign prince. Satirists painted him as a busybody meddling where he didn't belong. His thriftiness was mocked as cheapness. His reforms were branded as intrusion. His dislike of public spectacle was interpreted as coldness. He was not charming in the way the British like their royalty to be charming. He was meticulous, cerebral, unshowy, and he didn't earn his position, at least not in the eyes of those who believed monarchy was still something that needed to be earned, even if by blood. The xenophobic strain of British political culture, always lurking, found easy purchase. There was murmuring that Albert was being paid too much, that he was secretly running the government, that he was pushing Victoria to take German positions on European affairs. In Parliament, some MPs protested giving him a proper income. Public suspicion hardened into opposition during moments of national tension, especially when domestic politics turned sour. Albert responded not with charm offensives, but with infrastructure. He buried himself in projects, educational reform, housing improvement, modern sanitation, and above all, the Great Exhibition of 1851, a massive industrial showcase that sought to define Britain as the epicenter of global progress. It was a triumph, eventually. But even then, there were critics who saw it as too cosmopolitan, too European, too obviously the vision of a foreign mind with foreign tastes. He couldn't win. To be fair, he didn't lose either. Over time, many of his initiatives gained respect. He helped professionalize the monarchy, streamlining its finances, modernizing its public image, and insulating it from some of the corruption and frivolity that had plagued previous reigns. He was never widely loved, but he was gradually, grudgingly acknowledged as necessary. But love never came easily to Albert outside the palace walls. In public, he was stoic and formal. In private, he was often exhausted and melancholy, torn between his sense of duty and his awareness that he would never be accepted on his own terms. His relationship with Victoria was intensely close, but also emotionally complex. She depended on him for guidance. He sometimes resented the burden. He was, in many ways, a man out of place, a continental intellectual dropped into the most emotionally constipated monarchy in Europe. And then, suddenly, he was gone. Albert died in 1861 at the age of 42. Officially, the cause was typhoid. Unofficially, the country fell into a mourning period so intense it felt like the end of something larger than one life. Victoria, devastated, retreated from public life. Statues were erected, myths were constructed, and Albert was recast, not as the unpopular outsider, but as the perfect consort, tragically taken before his time. History forgave him, but it took death to do it. During his lifetime, Albert bore the weight of suspicion, not because he ruled, but because he was seen to influence. He wasn't hated for what he did. He was resented for what people imagined he might be doing. His crime was quiet competence in a role that wasn't supposed to require it. 26. William II, Rufus. He went by Rufus, meaning the red, thanks to his ruddy complexion and flame-colored hair. But in the darker corners of monastic chronicles, he earned other labels, none of them flattering. To the clerical class, William II was not merely a bad king. He was an offense, a walking contradiction to everything a medieval Christian ruler ought to be. And unlike some monarchs who gained a posthumous reputation for cruelty or scandal, Rufus was already unpopular while he was alive, at least among those writing the history books. William Rufus was the third son of William the Conqueror, but the one who inherited the English throne in 1087 after his father's death. His older brother Robert got Normandy. His younger brother Henry got money. William got a kingdom, and within a few years, more than a few enemies. Not necessarily because he was bloodthirsty or incompetent. In fact, by medieval standards, William II was reasonably effective. He kept the peace, mostly, beat back rebellion, and centralized royal power. But his methods, personality, and total disregard for churchly approval made him an ecclesiastical nightmare. This is key to understanding his unpopularity. It was shaped heavily by the chroniclers, almost all of whom were monks, priests, or affiliated with church institutions. And William made no effort to win them over. He delayed filling key bishoprics and abbeys, not out of neglect, but strategy. When a seat was empty, the king could collect the revenues. The most notorious example was the Archbishopric of Canterbury. When Archbishop Lanfranc died in 1089, Rufus refused to appoint a successor for years, keeping the church's income for himself. To the clergy, this was not just greedy, it was sacrilegious. When he finally did appoint someone, it was Anselm, a famously pious and principled churchman. The relationship soured almost instantly. William wanted a pliable church. Anselm gave him theology. Their battles over church authority, especially investiture, the right to appoint bishops, became emblematic of the larger conflict between monarchy and papacy sweeping across Europe. But this wasn't just policy. Chroniclers painted William II as arrogant, blasphemous, and immoral. They accused him of surrounding himself with effeminate courtiers, of mocking the church, of living a life of unchecked excess. Modern historians are cautious with these claims. They may reflect more about monastic disapproval than fact, but the venom is undeniable. He was also portrayed as secretive, repressive, and exploitative in his use of justice. Not that he didn't enforce the law, he did. But fines and fees were central to his system. Justice, in his England, was expensive. It wasn't about fairness, it was about revenue, and people noticed. Taxation under Rufus was notoriously heavy, especially during war preparations. He had grand ambitions in Normandy, sought to expand royal control across the Channel, and waged intermittent campaigns that drained the treasury and the patience of taxpayers. When funds ran low, his justiciars turned up the heat. Legal fees, fines, obligatory gifts. The fiscal pressure built, and public sentiment soured. Rural England may have been quiet, but it was not content. Even the nobility had reasons to grumble. William's control was tight. He was no puppet king. He demanded loyalty, suppressed revolt, and favored new men over traditional aristocrats when it suited him. This created resentment among the old Norman guard, some of whom had expected a weaker ruler they could manipulate. But the real measure of William's unpopularity wasn't rebellion, it was reputation. After his sudden and mysterious death in 1100, shot by an arrow during a hunting expedition in the New Forest, chroniclers wasted no time writing their verdicts. He had been struck down, they said, as divine punishment. His death wasn't a tragedy. It was justice. The most famous account is from Orderic Vitalis, who wrote that the Red King perished and no man mourned. That last part wasn't strictly true, but it captured the tone of the age. William's brother, Henry, wasted no time seizing the throne. He left Rufus's body where it fell, hurried to Winchester to grab the treasury, and was crowned days later. There was no state funeral, no national mourning, just a quiet burial at Winchester Cathedral, and a legacy left to the mercy of monks. Some historians have pushed back. They argue that William was a capable ruler, caught in a smear campaign by hostile churchmen. They point out that he kept order, balanced baronial ambitions, and laid groundwork for a more centralized monarchy. They note that he had supporters, allies, a functioning court. But the deeper truth is harder to untangle, because William's reputation is one of the most filtered through religious judgment of any English king, and that's what makes him such a haunting figure. He ruled a kingdom still adjusting to conquest, walked a political tightrope between ambition and rebellion, and died under mysterious circumstances in a royal forest that some swore was cursed. Whether his enemies outlived him or simply outwrote him, Rufus became a warning story. Not about tyranny, but about hubris. About a king who dared to rule without reverence, and whose story was shaped by those he failed to charm. Which brings us to the final figure on this list. A king remembered not for how he ruled England, but for how he ruled over others. To some, he was a builder of an empire. To others, he was the iron fist of English conquest. But wherever Edward I went, resentment followed. 27. Edward were unpopular to those he conquered or taxed. Edward I liked to think of himself as a restorer of order. In his own mind, he wasn't a tyrant or a brute. He was a builder, a legislator, a king who took the mess he inherited and hammered it into something solid, something permanent. And to be fair, he succeeded. England under Edward became more centralized, more legally coherent, and more aggressively governed than ever before. But permanence has a price, and Edward made sure other people paid it. Born in 1239, Edward grew up watching his father, Henry III, lose control of the kingdom again and again. Baronial rebellions, financial chaos, public humiliation. Edward learned a simple lesson from all of it. Compromise looks a lot like weakness if you don't win in the end. So when he took the throne in 1272, he ruled with a clarity his father never had, and with a hardness many would never forgive. In England proper, Edward was not universally hated. In fact, some admired, some him. He reformed the law, clarified land rights, strengthened royal courts, and made Parliament a more regular instrument of government. But those achievements came with relentless demands for money, loyalty, and obedience. Edward governed like a man constantly preparing for war, because he usually was. And the first place that learned what that meant was Wales. Edward viewed Wales as unfinished business, a loose end left dangling by generations of English kings who lacked either the will or the resources to finish the job. The Welsh princes had long maintained a fragile independence, ruling through their own customs and laws. Edward had no patience for that arrangement. Between 1277 and 1283, he launched a series of campaigns that crushed organized Welsh resistance and dismantled native leadership. What followed was not integration, it was occupation. Edward imposed English law, installed English officials, and built an iron ring of castles across the landscape. These weren't defensive afterthoughts. They were statements of dominance, looming over towns and valleys as reminders that resistance had an expiration date. To the English crown, it was consolidation. To the Welsh, it was subjugation. And resentment didn't fade just because the banners changed. Edward's reputation in Wales became fixed early and never softened. He was remembered not as a ruler, but as a conqueror, one who replaced native authority with distant administration and funded it through heavy demands on a population that had no say in the matter. Scotland, however, would prove more complicated. Edward initially entered Scottish politics as an arbitrator, invited to settle a succession dispute after the Scottish king died without a clear heir. But Edward did not arbitrate like a neutral party. He demanded that Scotland recognize him as feudal overlord before he would even begin. Some Scottish nobles agreed under pressure. Others saw it for what it was, a legal trap. When Edward later tried to enforce that overlordship, the situation collapsed into war. The Scottish Wars of Independence were long, bitter, and defined by cycles of occupation and resistance. Edward won major battles, he took castles, he imposed governors. He believed more than once that Scotland was finished. But each time resistance re-emerged, first under William Wallace, later under Robert the Bruce. To Edward, this was rebellion. To the Scots, it was survival. His campaigns devastated the countryside, drained resources, and hardened national identity against him. English chronicles praised his determination. Scottish memory preserved his cruelty. The nickname, Hammer of the Scots, was meant as a compliment. It didn't land that way north of the border. Even within England, Edward's authority came at a cost. War is expensive. Castles are expensive. Bureaucracy is expensive. And Edward paid for it all through taxation. He levied heavy demands on nobles and clergy, imposed duties on trade, especially wool, and summoned Parliament repeatedly to approve funds. When consent wasn't forthcoming, pressure followed. This created friction with nearly every powerful group in the kingdom. Barons protested. Church leaders resisted. Merchants complained. Edward was forced, more than once, to issue concessions acknowledging limits on royal power in exchange for financial support. He didn't enjoy it, but he accepted it when necessary, then pushed again when the opportunity returned. One of the darkest chapters of his reign came in 1290, when Edward ordered the expulsion of England's Jewish population. Jewish communities had long been subject to restrictive laws and heavy taxation, and Edward had extracted enormous sums from them over the years. When their economic usefulness declined, and when political pressure made it convenient, he removed them entirely, seizing property and debts in the process. The decision was popular among many contemporaries. It was also devastating and permanent. England would not officially allow Jewish resettlement for centuries. Edward's sense of order did not extend to mercy, and his definition of unity did not include everyone under his rule. So was Edward I despised? Not in the simple universal sense that some kings were. He wasn't mocked like George IV or overthrown like Richard II. He wasn't pitied like Henry VI or feared like James II. His unpopularity was sharper, more focused, and more enduring in the places where his rule felt most like force. To the Welsh, he was the man who ended independence. To the Scots, he was the face of conquest. To taxpayers and clergy, he was relentless. To minorities, he was exclusion-made policy. Edward believed deeply in law, hierarchy, and authority. He wanted a kingdom that worked, and he was willing to crush resistance to make it so. In that sense, he succeeded. But success does not erase memory. It sharpens it. He died in 1307 while on campaign, still trying to bring Scotland fully under control. His body returned to England. His wars did not end with him. And his legacy, strong, efficient, uncompromising, passed to a son utterly unequipped to carry it. Edward I left behind castles, statutes, and borders redrawn by force. He also left behind entire populations who remembered exactly how those things had been achieved. And history, like the people Edward ruled, never forgot how much order can feel like oppression, especially when you're the one being ordered.